Red hair is one of the rarest and most striking traits in human history. But where did it really come from? Was it shaped by ancient climates, hidden migrations, or a genetic mutation that survived against the odds for thousands of years? Behind this vivid colour lies a much deeper story about evolution, survival, and the strange ways the past still lives inside the human body. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The first thing anyone notices is how improbable it looks. In a crowd of dark heads and brown heads, and pale brown heads touched by ordinary sunlight, a single flare of copper or rust or ember red seems almost unreal, as if some older world has briefly stepped into the present and refused to leave. Red hair does that. It has a way of looking less like a colour than a surviving trace, a leftover signal from a much deeper human story. Even now, in a species spread across every climate on Earth, it remains rare. Only a small fraction of the global population carries it naturally, and yet it occupies a place in the imagination far larger than its numbers should allow. It appears in old portraits, in folklore, in suspicion, in admiration, in jokes, in insults, in dynastic myths, in whispered claims about ancestry, in modern genetic tests that promise to uncover hidden inheritance. It has been treated as beautiful, dangerous, weak, magical, foreign, ancestral, unlucky, noble, and strange. Few human traits have carried so much narrative weight while revealing so little of their true origin at first glance. That is where the mystery begins, not with vanity or fashion, but with a question so old that it reaches back beyond written language. Why does this colour exist at all? Why does it appear in some families and vanish in others? Why has it persisted, generation after generation, despite remaining uncommon almost everywhere? And why did human evolution, so deeply shaped by climate, migration, diet, disease, and chance, leave behind this particular strand of variation as one of its most visible signatures? Beneath the familiar image of freckles and pale skin and bright hair lies a story that does not begin in salons or royal courts or medieval superstition. It begins in deep prehistory, in the long movement of human bodies across changing landscapes, under different suns, through cold seasons, shrinking populations, and long eras when survival depended on invisible biological trade-offs no one could yet understand. Long before red hair becomes a cultural identity, it is first a biochemical outcome. Long before it becomes a stereotype, it is a mutation. Long before anyone writes about it, fears it, or celebrates it, it exists as a slight alteration in how the body handles pigment. But that simple description is deceptive. Human pigmentation is one of the great visible records of evolution, shaped over immense spans of time by the needs and pressures of life in different places. Skin, hair, and eyes are not random decorations. They are interfaces between the body and the world. They absorb or reflect light. They shield delicate chemistry from ultraviolet radiation. They regulate vitamin production. They reveal ancestry imperfectly, and adaptation only partly, like all human traits. They are products of history, but not neat ones. Evolution rarely writes in straight lines. It leaves fragments, compromises, and lingering exceptions. Red hair may be one of the clearest examples of that messiness, a vivid trait produced by precise genetic changes, preserved through unclear pressures, amplified by small populations, and then wrapped in stories that often say more about society than biology. Imagine Europe near the end of the last ice age, or just after it, when much of the landscape is harsher, thinner, and less settled than the worlds that come later. The forests are not yet the forests of fairy tales. Some regions are open and raw, shaped by retreating glaciers, cold winds, and seasons of scarcity. Human groups are small. Distances feel enormous. The dead disappear into soils that preserve almost nothing. Firelight glows in temporary shelters. Animal skins dry in the cold. Rivers shift. Coastlines lie in places that now drown beneath modern seas. In these worlds, human appearance is not a matter of aesthetic preference. It is tied, however indirectly, to survival. And somewhere in those long chains of inheritance, in those scattered groups moving across northern latitudes, variants arise in the genes that influence pigmentation. Some vanish, some remain. One of those pathways will eventually produce red hair. What makes that persistence so striking is that rarity usually works against visibility in history. Most rare traits leave little mark. They flicker through generations and attract no special meaning. Red hair does the opposite. It is rare enough to stand out, but stable enough to endure. That combination is powerful. Human beings are pattern-making animals, and conspicuous rarity invites explanation. In ancient and medieval worlds, where heredity is observed but not understood, visible difference becomes a canvas for moral ideas. A trait that appears unpredictably can seem like a sign, a warning, a blessing, or a curse. Red hair has been burdened with all of those at different times, but the deeper truth is more interesting than the myths. It is not mysterious because it is supernatural. It is mysterious because it sits at the crossroads of genetics, adaptation, migration, and chance, and because none of those forces acts alone. The temptation, of course, is to search for a single answer. People often want one origin point, one ancient tribe, one vanished people, one climate event, one ancestral homeland from which the red-haired gene emerges and spreads outward with documentary clarity. Human history almost never grants that kind of simplicity. The evidence remains incomplete. Genes move through populations in complicated ways. Traits can appear in one region, persist in another, and become culturally associated with a third. What survives in the record suggests a history of gradual accumulation and uneven inheritance rather than a single dramatic beginning. Even so, the search has drawn in geneticists, anthropologists, historians, and generations of curious amateurs because red hair seems to promise something unusually intimate. The possibility that a visible feature in the mirror might connect a living person to the hidden machinery of human evolution. That promise has inspired both insight and nonsense. Popular culture has often inflated red hair into a marker of special ancestry. Secret bloodlines, vanishing peoples, or mystical inheritance. Unsupported theories have linked it to lost civilizations, to singular ethnic origins, even to imagined categories of human difference that collapse under scrutiny. These ideas persist because they satisfy an emotional desire for dramatic stories. Yet the real story, grounded in mainstream science, is more compelling precisely because it is less tidy. It involves genes that regulate pigment production, but also sunlight levels, vitamin D pressures, demographic bottlenecks, and the random arithmetic of inheritance in small populations. It involves migration across prehistoric Europe, but also the fact that genes associated with a trait can survive without ever becoming common. It involves ancient DNA, but also all the gaps that ancient DNA cannot fill. Scholars still debate important parts of the picture. No single explanation fully accounts for why red hair persists at the frequencies it does, or why it became concentrated in some places more than others. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. And so the mystery of red hair is really a mystery about how evolution works when it leaves traces that are obvious to the eye but ambiguous in meaning. The modern world often imagines evolution as something ancient and finished, a slow drama confined to fossils and vanished species. But human evolution does not belong only to the remote past. It continues through variation, reproduction, selection, movement, and accident. Traits like red hair remind us that visible differences are not fixed symbols but outcomes of ongoing history. They persist not because nature assigns them identities, but because populations move, separate, merge, shrink, expand, and survive under shifting conditions. The body carries those histories quietly. Sometimes it carries them in the shape of a nose or the chemistry of digestion or the immune system's memory. Sometimes it carries them in a color that catches fire in sunlight. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand red hair, it helps to step away from the modern assumptions attached to it. Today, it is often treated as a quirky category, a personality shorthand, even a commercial niche. Entire industries of dye, entertainment, and branding lean on the idea that red hair means something immediately legible. Yet biologically, it is not a category at all in the way everyday language implies. It is part of a spectrum of pigmentation outcomes produced by interacting genes, inherited combinations, and environmental context. There is no ancient tribe of red-haired humanity standing apart from everyone else. There is no clean dividing line between those who carry relevant genetic variants and those who do not. There are only populations, frequencies, probabilities, and the long afterlife of traits that survive because the human story is one of continual mixing rather than pure descent. That matters because the visible rarity of red hair has so often invited essentialism. Entire nations have been reduced to it, as though a dramatic but uncommon trait could define millions. Entire historical narratives have been built around it, usually by outsiders eager to turn biology into legend. But a rare trait does not define a people. It reveals only that populations preserve history in uneven ways. A gene can become more common in one region not because it belongs there in some timeless sense, but because of founder effects, isolation, marriage patterns, or pure chance unfolding over centuries. Another population may carry the same variants more quietly, at lower frequencies, never turning them into part of a public identity at all. One of the most important truths in this story is that the modern map of red hair is not the map of its entire past. That is why the journey backward becomes so absorbing. Each answer opens into another uncertainty. The biology points toward pigment chemistry. The genetics point toward specific mutations. The geography points toward northern latitudes. The archaeological record points toward migrations and bottlenecks. Ancient DNA adds pieces, then complicates them. Even the famous association between red hair and certain parts of the British Isles, so familiar that many people treat it as self-explanatory, turns out to be only one chapter in a much older and broader history. By the time that symbolism forms, the genes involved have already travelled through countless lives, through people who leave no names, through children born into worlds without maps, through winters that erase settlements and summers that briefly flood valleys with green. So the colour that looks, at first glance, like a surface detail is not a surface detail at all. It is a tiny flame at the edge of a much larger human record. It asks how bodies change when environments change. It asks how rare traits endure without taking over. It asks what happens when a biological variation becomes a cultural obsession. And it asks, more quietly, whether visible difference can ever be read simply? The answer, almost always, is no. But that does not make the search less worthwhile. It makes it more human. Red hair survives at the intersection of chemistry and myth, ancestry and accident, deep time and daily life. To follow it backward is to follow the species itself into colder lands, narrower populations, uncertain adaptations, and the strange persistence of traits that history never entirely explains. The mystery begins to sharpen the moment the colour is stripped of its symbolism and reduced to what it really is: pigment, or rather a particular imbalance in pigment. What looks from a distance like flame, copper, rust, strawberry gold, or deep auburn is, in biological terms, the visible result of how the human body makes and distributes melanin. Every human head, regardless of ancestry or climate, grows hair from follicles that depend on specialized cells called melanocytes. These cells manufacture pigment and pass it into the developing hair shaft. The process is microscopic, chemical, and automatic, but its outcomes fill the world with enormous visible variation. Black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, and red hair are not separate materials. They are different expressions of a shared pigment system, altered by ratios, concentrations, timing, and inheritance. At the center of that system are two broad forms of melanin. One is eumelanin, the darker pigment associated with black and brown shades. The other is pheomelanin, the lighter reddish-yellow pigment that, when produced in greater proportion, gives hair its red or ginger tones. These two pigments can exist together, and in most people they do. Hair color emerges not from one being present and the other absent, but from the balance between them, the amount produced, and how densely pigment is packed into the hair itself. This is why human hair can vary so subtly from one person to another, and even on one head across a lifetime. Children may be born pale blonde and darken later. Brown hair can look chestnut in summer light and nearly black in winter. Red hair can range from faint gold touched with copper to a deep iron-rich tone that seems almost brown indoors until the sun catches it and reveals what has been hidden there all along. That hiddenness matters. Red hair is easy to notice when it's bright, but the pigment behind it exists on a continuum. The biology is not arranged in neat social categories. There are people whose hair is unmistakably red from infancy, people whose beards grow in red despite darker hair elsewhere, people whose children inherit tones that seem to leap unexpectedly across generations, and people who carry genetic variants associated with red hair without expressing the trait in a dramatic way at all. What survives in the record suggests that the striking versions of the trait are only the most visible tip of a broader and more diffuse pattern of human pigmentation. This is one reason red hair has often seemed mysterious in families. It can appear where no one expects it, not because it has come from nowhere, but because inheritance is full of combinations quietly waiting for the right arrangement. Hair itself is also a poor witness if taken alone. The shaft that emerges from the scalp is made mostly of keratin, a structural protein, and once it leaves the follicle, it is no longer living tissue. It cannot change its pigment actively in the way skin responds to sunlight. Its color reflects what happened during growth, when melanocytes deposited melanin into the hair as it formed. A red-haired child is therefore carrying, strand by strand, the outcome of thousands of invisible cellular decisions made beneath the skin. That visible result can appear almost decorative in modern life, but in evolutionary terms, pigment has never been merely decorative. It belongs to a larger protective and metabolic system that links the body to solar radiation, vitamin chemistry, cellular damage, and the balance between shielding and exposure. Skin makes that connection clearer, and red hair cannot be fully understood apart from skin. The same pigment system that colors hair also influences complexion, tanning ability, and the body's response to ultraviolet light. Individuals with naturally red hair often have fairer skin and a reduced capacity to tan deeply, though there is wide variation and no trait is absolute. Freckling is common because pigment may be distributed unevenly, clustering in small concentrated patches rather than creating a more uniform tone. In practical terms, this means that the bodies most associated with red hair often interact with sunlight differently. They may burn more quickly, they may synthesize vitamin D under certain conditions more efficiently, with lower levels of skin pigmentation. They may also face risks linked to ultraviolet exposure. Those trade-offs become important later, when the story turns toward latitude and climate. But even here, at the level of basic biology, it becomes clear that red hair is not an isolated curiosity. It is part of a suite of pigmentation outcomes shaped by pressures far older than culture. The language of everyday life obscures this. People speak of hair color as though it were as simple as paint, as though red were laid down over the strands like dye. The follicle tells a more complicated story. Melanocytes do not merely pour in color, they follow molecular instructions, responding to signals that regulate which form of melanin is favored. More eumelanin means darker hair. More pheomelanin means warmer, redder tones. But this is not just a spectrum from dark to light. Pheomelanin has different chemical properties. It contains sulfur. It reflects light differently. It produces that unmistakable warmth, which can make red hair appear almost luminous in weak sunlight, as if it is storing the memory of fire. Even that poetic impression has a scientific basis in how pigment interacts with light. There is an irony here. Human beings have spent centuries attaching extravagant stories to red hair, yet the fundamental mechanism behind it is almost modest in scale. No special organ produces it. No unique human subtype carries it. It depends on ordinary cells following slightly altered instructions. But evolution often works through small modifications with outsized effects. A slight change in regulation can transform appearance. A subtle shift in pigment production can become, over generations, one of the most socially loaded traits in a population. Biology produces the variation. Human culture magnifies it until it seems larger than life. The magnification begins because visible traits are easy to notice but hard to interpret. Hair color can be seen immediately. Unlike immune function or metabolic efficiency or inherited resistance to certain diseases, it becomes part of first impressions, family resemblance, and local memory. Communities notice it when it is rare. Parents speculate about it when it appears in a child. Chroniclers describe it in rulers and enemies alike because unusual appearance is memorable. Yet none of this says anything by itself about origin. The pigment system only explains how the trait is made, not why particular variants spread, persisted, or remained uncommon. That deeper question will require genes, migration, and adaptation. Still, without understanding pigment first, the rest becomes misleading. Red hair is not an emblem waiting for interpretation. It is a biological outcome waiting to be placed into history. And even here the biology resists oversimplification. Not every red-haired person has exactly the same shade because not every follicle is operating with identical chemistry. Hair thickness, age, sun exposure, and the interaction of multiple genes can alter the final effect. Some red hair appears more golden because yellowish pheomelanin dominates. Some appears deeper and richer because small amounts of eumelanin remain present alongside it. Eyebrows may be lighter. Eyelashes may differ from scalp hair. Beards often surprise people by revealing more red than the hair on the head, because different follicles can express pigmentation genes somewhat differently across the body. Scholars still debate the exact contribution of some secondary genes beyond the best-known pathways, and the evidence remains incomplete on how all interactions combine in every individual. But the central picture is secure. Red hair appears when the pigment balance shifts away from darker eumelanin and toward reddish pheomelanin. That shift carries costs and advantages which are not always visible. Pheomelanin is less effective at shielding against ultraviolet radiation than high concentrations of eumelanin. In strong equatorial sunlight, darker pigmentation generally offers better protection to skin and underlying biological processes. In weaker sunlight, especially at high latitudes, heavy pigmentation can reduce the efficiency with which skin produces vitamin D. This tension helps explain why human pigmentation varies so widely across the planet. Yet hair color is not a direct map of skin color, and both are influenced by overlapping but not identical genetic systems. A person can have fair skin and dark hair, olive skin and light eyes, brown hair with reddish undertones, or clearly red hair within a population not otherwise known for it. Human variation is cumulative, layered, and often untidy. The old desire to read one visible trait as a complete story about ancestry always breaks down under closer inspection. Still, there is something revealing in the way red hair catches light. The color looks unstable, almost shifting, because our eyes register it differently under different conditions. Indoors it can seem subdued, even brownish. Outdoors it can ignite. In weak northern sunlight it may look soft and muted. In direct afternoon light it can become almost metallic. This optical quality may help explain part of its cultural power. Red hair is not only uncommon, it is dramatically responsive to the environment around it. It announces itself suddenly, then recedes. It looks both natural and improbable at once, in pre-modern societies, where unusual appearance could easily become attached to memory and story. That quality must have intensified the sense that the trait signified something deeper. The biology says otherwise, or rather, it says something more subtle. It signifies chemistry, inheritance, and evolutionary history, but not destiny. There is also the simple fact that humans are highly visual creatures. Any trait that appears in infancy and remains visible throughout life becomes a marker through which families trace resemblance and difference. Hair color, especially when rare, becomes one of the ways people imagine inheritance before they understand genetics. A dark-haired couple with a red-haired child does not simply observe pigment. They confront a puzzle. In the modern world, the puzzle has an answer grounded in recessive inheritance and hidden genetic variants. In earlier centuries, it invited speculation of every kind. Yet the follicle had already solved the question long before any person asked it. The pigment cells knew what instructions they were following. The molecules assembled in silence. The hair emerged carrying a history invisible to everyone but the body. That is why the study of pigment matters so much at the beginning of this journey. It clears away illusion. Red hair is not a surface oddity added to humanity from outside the system. It is produced by the same machinery that colors all human hair, but pushed into a different balance. That balance depends on the body's preference for one pigment over another, and that preference in turn depends on genetic signals inherited across generations. Once that is understood, the mystery changes form. The question is no longer what red hair is made of. The question becomes who first carried the mutations that encouraged this pigment shift, how often those mutations arose, and why they endured in populations where darker forms of melanin so often dominate. The color now leads inward, away from the visible strand and toward the instructions that shape it. Somewhere in the human genome, small changes alter the chemistry of pigment and leave behind one of the most recognizable traits on Earth. That is where the trail goes next. The trail narrows in the genome, and once it does, red hair begins to look less like a poetic accident and more like the result of a very specific molecular detour. Among the many genes that influence human pigmentation, one stands above the rest in the story of red hair, MC1R, short for melanocortin-1 receptor. The name sounds clinical and distant, but its role is surprisingly intimate. It helps determine what kind of melanin the body is inclined to produce. In effect, it is one of the switches that guides pigment cells toward darker eumelanin or toward the reddish-yellow pheomelanin that gives red hair its unmistakable tone. When this gene functions in one way, darker pigment is favored. When certain variants alter that function, the balance shifts, the chemistry changes. The body begins to make more pheomelanin and less eumelanin. A visible human trait emerges from a minute change in molecular instructions. That transformation is easy to underestimate because the word mutation still carries the burden of fiction. It sounds sudden, dramatic, almost monstrous, as though the genome were being violently rewritten. In reality, most mutations are small. They are copying changes, substitutions, tiny alterations in the genetic code that may do nothing at all, or may slightly affect how a protein works, or may change when it is activated, or may weaken a signal instead of erasing it. Evolution depends on this quiet background of change. Every population carries mutations. Every lineage preserves some and loses others. Most never become visible in any obvious way. But occasionally a change lands in a gene with consequences that can be seen from across a room. MC1R is one of those rare cases where the molecular and the visible meet almost directly. The receptor encoded by this gene sits on the surface of melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells already waiting in the follicle. It responds to chemical signals that help instruct those cells which form of melanin to make. When the receptor is working in its standard way, signaling tends to promote eumelanin production. When particular variants reduce or alter that signaling, the cell's behavior changes and pheomelanin becomes more prominent. This is why so many red-haired individuals carry variants in MC1R. Though the relationship is not always absolute or simple, some variants are strongly associated with red hair. Others influence shade more subtly or contribute only in combination with additional genetic factors. The evidence is strong that MC1R is central, but not that it acts alone in every case. Human pigmentation, like most traits, is a network rather than a single line. Even so, MC1R has become famous because of how unusually direct its influence can be. In many traits, dozens or hundreds of genes each contribute tiny effects that are difficult to isolate cleanly. Red hair is not that simple, but it is simpler than many other visible traits. Certain MC1R variants have large enough effects that researchers can meaningfully trace their association with red hair, fair skin, and freckling. This has made the gene one of the most discussed examples in popular genetics. It has also made it vulnerable to oversimplification. The public often hears about a red hair gene, as if one switch alone turns the trait on or off. The real picture is more layered. There are several known MC1R variants associated with red hair, and they do not all behave identically. Some are more strongly penetrant, meaning they more consistently produce visible red hair when inherited in certain combinations. Others are weaker, contributing to reddish tones, freckles, or lighter pigmentation without creating the full classic expression people imagine. That complexity matters because inheritance rarely respects popular language. A person does not inherit red hair the way one inherits a single object passed down intact. They inherit gene variants from both parents, along with many background influences that affect how those variants are expressed. This is why red hair can seem to skip generations. Parents without visibly red hair may each carry MC1R variants quietly, hidden beneath darker pigment outcomes produced by other combinations. Their child, inheriting the right pair of altered variants, may then express the trait more clearly. What appears surprising at the family level is entirely ordinary at the genetic level. The code has been travelling unnoticed all along. The idea of recessive inheritance enters here, though even that familiar term needs care. Red hair is often described as recessive because two relevant variants, one from each parent, are frequently needed for the clearest expression of the trait. This is broadly useful as an explanation, especially in family genetics, but the reality is messier. Not all variants are equal, not all combinations behave the same way, and not every person with two altered versions of MC1R will look identical. Some may have vivid copper hair, others may have auburn or strawberry blonde. Some may show red more in facial hair than scalp hair. Some may have strong freckling and pale skin with only muted reddish undertones. No single explanation fully accounts for all outcomes because the body is not reading one gene in isolation. It is interpreting a whole genetic context. Still, the general pattern is clear enough to shape the history of how red hair moves through populations. If a trait requires uncommon combinations to be expressed dramatically, it can remain rare for very long periods, even while the underlying variants are more widespread. This helps solve one of the early puzzles. Red hair does not need to be common in order for the gene variants associated with it to survive. They can pass quietly through generations in carriers whose appearance gives little obvious sign of what they hold. Then, under the arithmetic of inheritance, the colour appears again. It seems sudden. In fact, it has been waiting. But waiting has consequences for how traits are distributed geographically. Visible red hair may cluster in some regions because the relevant variants become more frequent there, perhaps through isolation, founder effects, or long patterns of intermarriage within small populations. But the genetic story is broader than the visible map. MC1R variants are found across different populations, though the specific variants and their frequencies differ. This is another reason the search for one pure origin becomes misleading. The gene itself is ancient as a functional piece of human biology, but the variants associated with red hair are not all the same age, and they may not all descend from one single recent event. Some could have arisen independently or spread through different demographic histories. Scholars still debate parts of this timeline, and ancient DNA has complicated some earlier assumptions. What matters is that visible red hair is not the fingerprint of one isolated people. It is the outcome of genetic pathways shaped by population history over deep time. There is a further irony in MC1R's importance. The gene is most famous for hair colour, yet from an evolutionary perspective it belongs to a broader pigmentation system connected to how the body deals with sunlight. A receptor that influences melanin production is not merely colouring hair for ornament. It is part of the body's larger negotiation with radiation, protection, and vitamin chemistry. This means that the variants associated with red hair may have persisted not because hair colour itself was selected directly, but because broader pigmentation patterns interacted with environmental pressures in particular ways. Or perhaps some variants survived under weak selection and simple demographic chance. The evidence remains incomplete. What survives in the record suggests that both adaptation and accident probably matter, but not in the same proportion everywhere. The fascination with MC1R has also led researchers to compare it across species, which adds an unexpected layer to the story. Variants in pigmentation genes can produce reddish coloration in other mammals as well, but not always through the same exact pathways or consequences. Biology reuses similar systems in different bodies, under different pressures. The appearance of red or pale coloration in animals can be tied to camouflage, signaling, thermal environment, or pure drift. The human case is distinctive not because pigment genes are unique to humans, but because human populations are embedded in culture, migration, and social meaning. A fox does not build myths around its coat. A human population does. Once a visible trait appears in people, it becomes social almost immediately. Yet at its root, MC1R remains indifferent to all of that. It modifies receptor signaling. The rest is history layered on top of chemistry. Perhaps the most striking thing about this gene is how it reveals the scale mismatch between cause and effect. At the molecular level, the change is tiny. A substitution in the genetic code alters an amino acid in a receptor protein, changing how efficiently signals pass along the melanocyte's pathway. At the visible level, the result may be a child whose hair seems to burn in sunlight, whose freckles scatter across the skin, whose appearance becomes part of family legend before they're old enough to understand it. Human identity is full of these scale mismatches. A microscopic alteration becomes a social category. A biochemical preference becomes a cultural symbol. The gene does not intend any of it, but once the color is there, history begins to gather around it. This is also where caution becomes necessary. Genes can explain mechanisms, but they do not tell stories by themselves. A gene variant is not a destiny, not a nationality, not a personality, not a moral feature, and certainly not a proof of some ancient superiority or hidden lineage. Red hair has attracted more than its share of romantic nonsense precisely because the biology is so concrete. Once people hear that a particular gene is involved, they begin to imagine that the whole trait can be reduced to a single ancestral key. But inheritance does not work like a locked box with one secret origin. Genes flow through populations that mix, split, and merge. Their meanings are assigned afterward. The science can identify pathways. It cannot justify myths. Yet it does offer something better than myth. It offers precision. It tells us that red hair is not a vague mystery of blood or temperament, but a discernible change in pigment regulation, strongly associated with MC1R and shaped by inherited combinations. It tells us why the trait can appear unexpectedly in families and why it can remain rare without disappearing. It tells us why freckles, fair skin, and sun sensitivity so often travel nearby. And it tells us that the story must now move beyond the gene itself and out into the environments where such variants either vanished or endured. A mutation can arise almost anywhere. The harder question is why certain mutations persist long enough to leave a visible mark on history. Somewhere in the long movement of human populations, MC1R variants that favor red pigmentation do more than appear. They survive. They pass through cold regions, dimmer skies, shrinking groups, and generations who never know what molecule is shaping the look of their children. The receptor sits on the melanocyte, silent and efficient, while glaciers advance and retreat, coastlines shift, and people push farther into lands where sunlight arrives differently than it did in Africa, where most of the species' earlier evolution had unfolded. By then, the mystery is no longer just genetic, it has become ecological. The next step is to ask what kind of world might allow such changes in pigmentation not only to emerge, but to remain. The deeper the story goes, the less red hair can be understood as an isolated feature, and the more it must be placed inside the ancient relationship between the human body and the sun. Long before people notice hair color as identity, before folklore or dynasties or modern population maps, sunlight is already acting on skin and pigment with relentless force. It is one of the oldest environmental pressures in human history, and one of the most consequential. Human beings evolve first in Africa under conditions where ultraviolet radiation is often intense, regular, and biologically important in ways both protective and dangerous. In that setting, pigmentation is never cosmetic. It is part of a living shield. Darker skin, rich in eumelanin, helps protect against the damaging effects of ultraviolet light, including harm to folate, a vitamin essential to fetal development and cellular health. It also reduces direct injury to skin tissue. Across long stretches of evolutionary time, strong sun favors protection. The body answers with pigment. That broad pattern is one of the clearest stories in human biology. Yet like all clear stories, it begins to complicate the moment populations move. As groups of Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and into Eurasia, they enter environments where the old balance between risk and benefit no longer looks the same. Sunlight changes with latitude. Ultraviolet radiation weakens. Seasons grow more extreme. Winters lengthen. Clouds, low-angle sunlight, clothing, and time spent indoors or under shelter all shape how much solar energy actually reaches the skin. In such settings, pigment becomes a trade-off. Too little protection can be dangerous under strong sun. Too much protection can become costly under weak sun because the skin also relies on ultraviolet light to synthesize vitamin D, a compound vital for bone health, immune function, and a long list of physiological processes that prehistoric people could not name but could not live without. This tension sits behind one of the most important evolutionary shifts in human appearance. As some populations moved into higher latitudes over many thousands of years, lighter skin becomes more common in several regions, though not through one universal path. Different populations arrive at lighter pigmentation by different genetic routes, a reminder that evolution often solves similar problems in more than one way. The change does not happen instantly, and it does not happen for everyone. Ancient populations mix, separate, and adapt unevenly. Still, the overall logic is strong. In places where sunlight is weaker for much of the year, bodies that can produce adequate vitamin D despite reduced ultraviolet levels may gain an advantage. Lighter pigmentation, by allowing more ultraviolet penetration into the skin, becomes beneficial under those conditions. Red hair enters this story not as the main event, but as one branch of a larger pigment system responding to these pressures. That distinction matters. It would be too simple to say that northern sunlight created red hair in any direct sense. The evidence does not support such a neat formula. Hair color and skin color overlap genetically but are not identical. A population can evolve lighter skin without producing much red hair, and many clearly light-skinned populations do exactly that. No single explanation fully accounts for why red hair-associated variants persist where they do. But once the story is widened to include sunlight, the trait begins to make more sense. Variants that reduce eumelanin production and allow greater expression of pheomelanin may become less costly in low UV environments than they would be closer to the equator. A body with fair skin and reduced pigmentation may be less protected from strong sun, but in cloudy northern latitudes the balance of risk changes. That change would not have been felt as theory by the people living through it. It would have been lived as ordinary survival. A child either grows well or does not. A woman carries a pregnancy to term or loses it. Bones remain strong or become more fragile. The body manages calcium or fails to do so. People sicken, recover, migrate, starve, endure winter, bury their dead, and continue. Evolution works through these accumulated realities, not through conscious choice. Nobody in prehistoric Europe decides to become lighter. Nobody seeks out red hair as a plan. Variants already present in the population are filtered gradually by environment, reproduction, and chance. The sun does not sculpt with intention. It simply keeps imposing conditions, generation after generation, and some bodies fit those conditions slightly better than others. What makes the red hair question especially elusive is that the trait may not have been selected for directly at all. This is one of the most important cautions in the entire story. When modern observers see a distinctive feature, they tend to assume nature must have wanted that feature specifically. But evolution does not operate like a designer choosing a finished look. A trait can survive because it rides alongside something else. Red hair may persist partly because the genetic changes that favour it also contribute to lighter pigmentation more broadly, which may have been advantageous in low UV regions, or it may persist because selection against it was weak enough that demographic history, isolation, and random inheritance could preserve it. Scholars still debate how much weight belongs to selection and how much to drift. The evidence remains incomplete because no Ice Age census records exist, and genes rarely leave behind neat explanations for why they survived. Still, the environmental context matters enormously. Imagine the difference between equatorial Africa and the far north of Europe in pre-modern conditions. The first offers intense sunlight across the year. The second offers long, dark seasons, lower angle sun, and months when the body must make do with what little ultraviolet it receives. Add heavy clothing, cloud cover, forest shade, and indoor shelter, and the challenge deepens. In such settings, pigmentation is not merely about avoiding damage. It is about extracting enough light from a stingier sky. Some researchers have argued that this pressure helped drive lighter skin in northern populations. That broader framework is well supported. Red hair then appears within that lighter pigment landscape as a rarer, more specialized expression of the same general reduction in eumelanin. Yet it is not enough to say low sunlight favors pale bodies and stop there. Human history resists tidy latitudinal rules. Diet complicates everything. Populations with access to vitamin D-rich foods, especially marine diets, may face less pressure to lighten skin because they can obtain essential nutrients without relying as heavily on sunlight-driven synthesis. This is one reason why northern populations do not all look the same, and why pigmentation maps never align perfectly with latitude alone. Migration also matters. A trait can appear in a place not because it evolved there from scratch, but because people carrying it moved there and remained. Intermarriage redistributes variance. Cultural practices alter exposure to sunlight. Even sexual selection, the possibility that visible traits become attractive and therefore more likely to persist, has occasionally been proposed in discussions of unusual pigmentation, though evidence for red hair specifically remains uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a layered process rather than a single cause. There's also a sobering point beneath the familiar modern image of pale skin and red hair. Traits that are manageable or even celebrated in one social and technological context may have carried very different consequences in another. A body that burns easily in strong sun can face real danger. A child with reduced protection in a brighter climate may suffer damage that affects long-term health. That means any variants associated with very fair pigmentation would likely have faced stronger constraints in high UV environments. Their persistence in northern latitudes therefore becomes easier to understand. The same trait can be costly in one region and relatively tolerable in another. Evolutionary success is always conditional. Nothing is advantageous everywhere. This is why red hair cannot be detached from the story of skin. Modern conversation often isolates hair colour as though it were an aesthetic category floating above biology. In reality, the systems are bound together. The same pathways that reduce dark pigmentation in the skin can help create the fair complexions commonly associated with red-haired individuals. Freckling, burning, and difficulty tanning are not random companions to red hair. They are signs that the body's pigment shield is operating under a different set of instructions. The hair becomes the visible banner of a more extensive shift. That shift, in turn, only makes sense when placed against the dimmer skies of northern latitudes and the metabolic demands of life there. And yet the temptation to turn this into a simple northern destiny must still be resisted. Red hair is not common across all northern peoples. Many high-latitude populations have little or none of it. Some populations with significant red hair frequencies are not the most northerly at all. Even within Europe, distribution is uneven. That unevenness is one of the strongest signs that sunlight alone cannot explain everything. Environmental pressure may help create the conditions under which lighter pigmentation becomes viable or advantageous, but it does not dictate exactly which variants will rise in frequency or where. History intervenes. Small founding groups carry limited genetic variation. Bottlenecks magnify some traits and erase others. Regions repeatedly emptied, resettled, or mixed will not preserve variation in the same way. By the time red hair becomes noticeable as a regional feature, demographic history is already doing as much work as climate. Even so, the ancient sun remains at the centre of the story because it defines the boundaries of what pigment can afford to do. Human bodies do not evolve in abstraction. They evolve beneath actual skies, in real seasons, under nutritional limits and mortal risk. A mutation affecting pigment may arise by chance, but whether it survives depends partly on whether the environment punishes or tolerates it. In the harsh brightness of lower latitudes, reductions in melanin carry greater costs. Under weaker northern sunlight, those costs may soften while other benefits emerge. Red hair, then, belongs to a world where pigment is being renegotiated, not invented from nothing, but recalibrated. By now, the outline of the mystery becomes clearer. Human populations move into places where old pigmentation strategies no longer fit perfectly. Lighter skin becomes more plausible, sometimes more advantageous. Within that broader shift, gene variants affecting melanin production accumulate and endure. Some of them make red hair possible, but possibility is not the same as prevalence. The trait remains rare, unstable in appearance, and uneven in geography. Something about it survives, but not widely enough to become ordinary. That tension between viability and rarity is one of the strongest clues of all. It suggests a trait that the environment can allow, but does not necessarily favour strongly enough to dominate. So the story leaves the sun, for a moment, and follows human groups into the particular landscapes where this allowance may have mattered most. The cold, dim edges of Europe, where survival is narrow, populations are small, and biology is shaped not only by adaptation, but by the hard arithmetic of who remains alive long enough to pass anything on at all. The farther north the human story moves, the narrower it becomes, not in significance, but in margins. The broad equatorial worlds where the species first evolved are full of heat, biodiversity, and light so abundant that the body must defend itself from excess. Northern Europe, by contrast, offers long seasons of restraint. Light arrives at an angle. Winter thins everything. cold reaches into the bones of the land. For much of prehistory, these are not settled, comfortable landscapes but difficult frontiers, repeatedly transformed by glacial advance, glacial retreat, flooding rivers, exposed plains, and coastlines that will later vanish beneath rising seas. This is the setting in which some of the most unusual pigmentation traits in human populations may have endured. Not because the North is mystical, and not because it belongs to any single people in a timeless sense, but because harsh environments do strange things to inheritance when the number of survivors is small. To imagine those conditions properly, it helps to strip away the later map of Europe with its kingdoms, languages, and national myths. Much of the far north is, for long stretches, a moving ecological edge. Ice sheets dominate large regions during the height of glaciation. South of them lie steppe tundra landscapes, cold grasslands, sparse woodland, migrating herds, exposed river valleys, and camps that may last only seasonally. Human groups are often scattered and mobile. Their lives depend on remembering routes, reading weather, following animals, exploiting short windows of abundance, and enduring long periods when the margin between sufficiency and collapse is painfully thin. In such settings, the body is under multiple pressures at once. Light is weaker, yes, but so are food security, population size, and the stability of social networks. Evolution in such places is never only about adaptation to climate. It is also about what happens when chance events strike small groups again and again. That matters because rare traits behave differently in small populations. In a large, well-mixed population, unusual gene variants may remain diluted across many lineages, surfacing only occasionally. In a smaller population, especially one cut off geographically or seasonally from others, those same variants can rise or disappear far more quickly. A few families survive a difficult winter, a few lineages leave more children than others, a migration corridor opens and then closes. A coastal refuge holds human life through centuries of instability while another region empties out. Under such conditions, the future of a pigmentation variant may depend less on strong selection than on who happens to endure. What survives in the record suggests that Northern Europe, particularly during and after the last ice age, provides repeated opportunities for this kind of demographic filtering. This does not mean the North simply manufactures red hair out of cold air and dim skies. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how much of the trait's later distribution reflects adaptation versus drift. But the environment creates a permissive zone. Variants that reduce eumelanin and contribute to fairer pigmentation are less strongly penalized than they would be under harsher ultraviolet conditions farther south. That alone may not explain red hair, but it changes the rules of survival for the variants involved. Once those variants exist in a population, a northern setting makes it easier for them to persist without severe cost. Then demography takes over. Small groups carry them unevenly. Isolation amplifies them in some places and erases them in others. By the time later populations begin to look recognizably regional, the deeper shaping has already occurred. The image of Ice Age Europe is often misunderstood because modern imagination fills it with heroic scale, but forgets human fragility. There are mammoths on the plains, reindeer trails across frozen ground, carved ivory, wind-scoured camps, and cave art deep in darkness. Yes, but there is also hunger, infection, childbirth without medicine, injury without certainty of healing, and a constant dependence on cooperation. The people living in these worlds are no less intelligent or emotionally complex than anyone alive today, but their populations are thin, They can vanish from regions entirely. Some do. Genetic studies increasingly suggest that parts of prehistoric Europe are repopulated more than once, with earlier groups reduced or absorbed as climates shift. In that setting, no trait travels through history smoothly. Every generation is a checkpoint. Every bottleneck reshuffles the odds. It is within this world of repeated narrowing that red hair-associated variants may begin to gain their peculiar foothold. The clue is not that the trait becomes common, because it does not. The clue is that it survives. Survival, for a rare trait, can be more informative than frequency. It suggests a balance in which the variant is tolerated, sometimes preserved, occasionally amplified, but not driven toward universal dominance. Northern Europe offers exactly that kind of balance. Lighter pigmentation more generally may be useful under low ultraviolet light, but red hair itself may never carry enough direct advantage to sweep through populations on its own. Instead, it persists as part of a broader fair pigment landscape, aided by the demographic volatility of small groups. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the pattern fits what is known about both evolutionary pressures and population history. There is another layer to the northern edge that deserves attention: seasonality. In equatorial or subtropical environments, sunlight and food supply may fluctuate, but not with the prolonged darkness characteristic of higher latitudes. In the north, entire ways of life must bend around the season. Summer is not merely warmer, it is a period of frantic opportunity. Winter is not merely colder, it is a compression of movement, resources, and tolerance. Such cycles can intensify the consequences of any trait linked, even indirectly, to vitamin D metabolism, skin response, or general resilience under low-light conditions. This does not prove that red hair itself is selected for. The science cannot support such a direct claim, but it reinforces the larger truth that pigmentation in the north is embedded in a radically different solar calendar than the one in which earlier human evolution unfolded. At the same time, Northern Europe is not one environment. This too is easy to flatten in hindsight. Open glacial margins, Atlantic coasts, inland forests, river valleys, and post-glacial wetlands all create different conditions for diet, mobility, and population contact. A community with strong access to fish or marine mammals may experience different nutritional pressures than one dependent mainly on terrestrial game. Forest expansion after the Ice Age changes movement patterns and hunting strategies. Rising seas cut off once connected regions, turning peninsulas into islands and narrowing corridors of contact. The ancient north is therefore a mosaic, not a single stage. A rare pigmentation trait may survive in one microhistory and disappear in another. Later concentrations do not necessarily mark where the trait began. They may simply mark where history happened to preserve it. This is one reason later nationalist readings of red hair are so misleading. Modern people look at present-day maps and imagine deep ancestral ownership, but prehistory is full of vanished distributions. Regions that now seem emblematic may once have been marginal, and places that later lose a trait may once have carried it more often. The north has been repopulated, mixed, and transformed many times. During the late glacial period and the millennia that follow, groups with different ancestries move through Europe in waves, overlap, merge, and sometimes replace earlier populations in substantial ways. Any visible trait that survives this must be both flexible and lucky. Red hair appears to be exactly that, not the banner of a single untouched lineage, but the recurring product of gene variants that pass through multiple human histories. There is also a subtler possibility that scholars sometimes consider, though the evidence remains uncertain that unusual visible traits can benefit from sexual selection in small communities. In plain terms, rarity itself can attract notice. A trait that stands out may become desirable under some circumstances simply because it is uncommon, memorable, or associated with youth or health in ways difficult to reconstruct from the archaeological record. This idea is hard to test, and it should be treated with caution. It is easy to project modern assumptions about beauty backward into worlds that may have valued entirely different things. Even so, the possibility lingers in discussions of unusual pigmentation. In a small northern population where many people look broadly similar, a rare colour may have social consequences that exceed its biological significance. Whether that helped preserve red hair is unknown. The evidence does not allow certainty, but it is part of the wider field of explanation that refuses to collapse into one cause. The harsher truth, however, is that much of what shaped the ancient North had nothing to do with preference. It was about endurance through unstable worlds. Glaciers retreat, exposing land that will only later support dense human occupation. Large animals move and vanish. Vegetation zones shift northward. Former hunting grounds flood as sea levels rise. Families relocate or disappear. The map is never still long enough for simplicity. Under these conditions, a gene variant survives not because history wants it to tell a later story, but because enough carriers remain alive, connected, and reproductively successful across repeated disruptions. That is a much less romantic explanation than folklore usually offers. But it is more convincing. Nature preserves some human differences not with grand intention, but with 1,000 narrow escapes, and those escapes accumulate. By the early Holocene, as the Ice Age loosens its grip and Europe warms, the northern world opens into new possibilities. Forests spread, waters rise, regional populations begin to differentiate in fresh ways. Yet the traits carried through the older bottlenecks do not vanish just because the climate softens. They remain in the gene pool, redistributed through new migrations and mixtures. A rare pigmentation pattern that survived the old cold now enters a more crowded human stage. It will meet farmers, herders, seafarers, traders, raiders, and empires still far in the future. But before any of that, one fact already stands out. The North did not need to make red hair common in order to make it durable. It only had to make it possible to survive. That possibility is one of the strongest clues in the whole mystery. Europe's dimmer edge does not hand over a complete answer, but it narrows the field. It suggests that the ancient environments most compatible with very fair pigmentation are also the ones where red hair-associated variants could endure with reduced penalty. It suggests that demographic instability could preserve unusual traits in pockets and lineages without ever making them universal. And it suggests that the later visibility of red hair owes at least as much to who remained in those landscapes as to any direct adaptive advantage. The story is no longer just about the sun. It is about survival at the edge of the habitable world, where small populations carry strange inheritances forward simply because they do not disappear. Yet if the North helps explain endurance, it does not explain the most puzzling feature of all. Why did red hair remain so uncommon? Why did it survive for thousands of years without ever becoming the default outcome, even in places where conditions seem to permit it? That rarity is not an incidental detail. It may be the best evidence of how limited, conditional, and historically fragile the trait has always been. If red hair were strongly favoured by natural selection in the places most often associated with it, the modern world would probably look very different. In regions of low sunlight, under the logic of simple adaptation, One might expect the trait to have spread widely and become ordinary. It did not. Even in the populations where red hair appears most often today, it remains a minority outcome. In most of the world, it is extremely rare. That stubborn rarity is one of the most revealing facts in the entire story, because it suggests that whatever allowed red hair to endure did not push it toward dominance. The trait survives. Yes, sometimes at noticeable levels, but always with limits. And those limits tell us something important about how evolution actually works. Not every trait that persists is strongly selected for, and not every visible feature represents the triumphant solution to an environmental challenge. Some survive in the margins, carried by inheritance, tolerated by circumstance, and shaped by history more than by direct biological advantage. This is where the idea of rarity becomes more than a statistical footnote. Rarity changes how a trait behaves in both biology and culture. In genetic terms, a trait associated with recessive inheritance can remain uncommon, even while the underlying variants travel widely through populations. Many people may carry one relevant variant without expressing the visible trait at all. The appearance of red hair therefore depends on combinations that are less frequent than the variants themselves. That alone helps explain why the colour can endure for thousands of years without becoming common. But it does not explain everything. Even if the gene variants are more widespread than the visible trait, there is still the larger question of why they never rose much higher in frequency. Something about the balance of pressures seems to hold them in check. One possibility is that red hair belongs to a broader zone of tolerated variation, rather than a directly favoured target. In other words, low UV northern environments may allow pigmentation-reducing variants to persist, without strongly rewarding the most extreme visible forms. Fairer skin may confer some advantage in certain contexts of vitamin D synthesis, but red hair itself may carry no special additional benefit beyond being one of several possible consequences of reduced eumelanin. If so, natural selection may act more generally on lighter pigmentation, while leaving the precise expression of hair colour partly to drift. Inheritance and population structure. This would help explain why lighter skin becomes common across many northern populations while red hair remains patchy, uneven, and rare. The environment opens the door but does not insist on this one outcome. There may also have been costs. This is crucial, because rare traits often persist in a balance between viability and disadvantage. Individuals with red hair commonly show characteristics linked to reduced protection from ultraviolet radiation, including fair skin, greater likelihood of freckling, and a tendency to burn rather than tan. In very low UV environments, these costs may be muted, but they do not vanish entirely, and in brighter seasons or lower latitudes they become more serious. A trait that is acceptable in one context may still carry enough limitation to prevent it from spreading too far. Evolution is full of such compromises. What is good enough to survive is not always good enough to dominate. Another possibility is simple demographic mechanics. Small populations can raise the local frequency of a rare variant through founder effects or repeated intermarriage among carriers. But once populations expand and mix more broadly, that local concentration may remain limited rather than spreading everywhere. This means red hair may become regionally noticeable without ever escaping minority status. A trait associated with isolated or semi-isolated communities often behaves this way. It flares in one part of the map, fades in another, and never fully detaches from the population history that preserved it. What survives in the record suggests that this kind of demographic pattern is likely part of the explanation. Red hair does not need to be strongly favoured if it is repeatedly carried through small, connected communities where the relevant variants meet often enough to stay visible. The rarity may even be part of why the trait continued to draw attention and therefore later acquired such cultural power. Human societies are quick to notice visible minorities, especially when they appear unpredictably within families. A rare trait resists becoming invisible. It remains memorable. It invites explanation. But that social visibility should not be confused with evolutionary importance. One of the great distortions in the story of red hair is that culture has treated it as larger than life, while biology appears to have treated it as something more modest, a durable but uncommon expression of pigment variation. The gene variants survive. The culture reacts as though something extraordinary has happened. In one sense, something extraordinary has happened, but only because human beings attach significance to what stands out. The fact that red hair remains rare even in famously associated regions also warns against older ideas that tried to explain it through single peoples or sweeping ethnic labels. If the trait truly belonged to one ancient group in a clean and dominant way, it would likely show a very different distribution. Instead, what appears is scattered concentration. There are places where red hair becomes more common, but not overwhelming. There are families where it reappears after absence. There are populations that carry relevant variants with little visible expression. This is exactly the kind of pattern expected from a trait shaped by recessive inheritance, migration, bottlenecks, and local amplification rather than simple linear descent from one red-haired people. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern, but rarity itself rules out many of the most romantic and simplistic stories. There is a deeper lesson in that evolution does not always push populations toward uniformity. Sometimes it preserves diversity. Sometimes it allows multiple workable outcomes to coexist, especially when environments are heterogeneous and human movement constantly reshuffles the map. In such a system, an unusual trait can survive indefinitely without ever becoming standard. Red hair may be one of those traits, not a dominant adaptation marching across the continent, but a persistent variant sheltered by the fact that human populations are never static. A famine, a migration, a marriage network, a regional collapse, a small island community, a valley cut off by weather, a coastal group with limited outside contact. These are the kinds of conditions that can keep rarity alive for longer than a neat model of selection would predict. Some researchers have also noted that when a trait is controlled by multiple variant combinations, even one strongly associated gene does not guarantee a fixed outcome across populations. This makes complete saturation even less likely. Red hair can emerge through several related genetic pathways, many of them centered on MC1R, but not all equally potent, because the visible expression depends on combination and context. The trait resists simple expansion. It can persist in carriers. It can surface unevenly. It can remain more common than chance in some regions without ever becoming the norm. The evidence remains incomplete on the contribution of every secondary genetic factor, but the broad effect is clear. The architecture of inheritance itself helps keep the trait rare. There is also the possibility that rarity was never a problem for the genes involved. A visible trait does not need to be common for its underlying variants to remain evolutionarily secure. As long as carriers reproduce successfully, the variants continue. In that sense, red hair may be rare only from the perspective of human perception, not from the perspective of long-term genetic persistence. People notice the phenotype, the visible result. Evolution tracks the alleles, the inherited variants, whether or not they light up in every generation. This distinction is easy to forget, yet it may be the key to the whole puzzle. The red hair phenotype is rare. The capacity for red hair may be much broader, distributed quietly through populations that do not visibly announce it. The trait appears to flicker because the combinations required to reveal it are less common than the inheritance that sustains it. Still, that answer is not entirely satisfying, because it explains maintenance more than meaning. Why does the colour feel so exceptional? Partly because the human eye is primed to notice anomalies, especially in hair, which frames the face and remains visible across the lifespan. A rare eye colour can be striking, but hair occupies more visual space, changes with light, and can be seen from a distance. Red hair, in particular, seems to oscillate between muted and luminous, which makes it feel even less ordinary. Its rarity, therefore, becomes magnified by perception. A trait present in only a modest minority can dominate memory because it is so visually arresting. This may help explain why red hair plays such an outsized role in folklore and literature. A rare trait generates more stories than a common one, but story making is not the same as historical prevalence. In fact, rarity may have protected red hair from becoming culturally neutral. Brown hair is too common to build entire myths around in most societies. Black hair, depending on the population, may be the baseline. Blonde hair has often been loaded with meaning too, but in regions where it is common, its symbolic charge can flatten. Red hair remains exceptional enough to resist that flattening. It never fully disappears into the background. That cultural persistence mirrors its biological persistence. In both cases, the trait hovers at the edge of the ordinary, never gone, never dominant, always available to be noticed again. The result is a kind of double survival. The genes continue through inheritance. The image continues through attention. From an evolutionary standpoint, this lingering minority status may be exactly what should be expected from a visible trait tied to reduced eumelanin production. The environment may permit it, demographic history may preserve it, and inheritance may occasionally reveal it in striking form, but none of that requires universal spread. Indeed, universal spread would likely require stronger and more direct selection than the evidence can support. Scholars still debate whether any special advantage attaches specifically to red hair, and the safer conclusion is that the trait persists within a broader matrix of fair pigmentation, rather than because nature singled it out as an ideal. Its rarity is therefore not a puzzle to be explained away. It is the clue. It tells us that red hair is real, enduring, and biologically grounded, but also conditional, contingent, and never fully secure. That combination of persistence and fragility is what gives the trait its strange historical character. Red hair survives, yet it always seems as though it might vanish. It appears in a family line, then disappears for generations. It defines a regional stereotype, yet remains uncommon even there. It is one of humanity's most recognizable inherited features, yet most people will never carry it. There is something almost archaeological about that pattern, as though the trait is not a broad landscape but a scattered set of surviving fragments. The temptation is to make those fragments into a lost civilization, a hidden ancestry, a dramatic secret. The reality is quieter, but no less compelling. Red hair stays rare because it was probably never meant, in evolutionary terms, to become the rule. It survives because human history is full of room for exceptions. And that raises another question, one that has attracted both serious science and endless sensationalism. If red hair remains an unusual modern trait with ancient roots, could some part of that story stretch back even beyond our own species? Could the colour, or something like it, have existed among other kinds of humans who once shared Eurasia with our ancestors, few ideas have done more to ignite the imagination than the suggestion that red hair may cast a shadow into the world of the Neanderthals. Few prehistoric figures have been loaded with more modern fantasy than the Neanderthals. Ever since their bones first emerged from European ground and unsettled 19th century assumptions about human uniqueness, they have been made to carry almost every projection imaginable. They have been cast as brutes, victims, cousins, rivals, near humans, noble survivors of ice and hunger, and shadowy doubles standing just outside the boundaries of ourselves. So it is no surprise that red hair, with all its own burden of rarity and myth, eventually became attached to them as well. The idea is irresistible at first glance. A cold-adapted human relative living for hundreds of thousands of years across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, moving through dim light and glacial margins, seems like an obvious candidate for unusual pigmentation. Popular culture took that suggestion and ran with it. Before long, illustrations of pale, red-haired Neanderthals were appearing in magazines, documentaries, museum displays, and speculative reconstructions, as though the question had already been settled. The truth is more careful, and more interesting for being careful. Scientists do have evidence that some Neanderthals carried a variant affecting pigmentation, and that variant could plausibly have produced lighter skin and reddish hair in at least some individuals. But the evidence does not mean that all Neanderthals were red-haired, or even that red hair was common among them. And it does not mean that modern human red hair descends directly from Neanderthals in any simple way. The fascination lies precisely in this narrow band between possibility and exaggeration. Scholars still debate aspects of pigmentation in Neanderthals, because ancient appearance is one of the hardest things to recover from fragmentary remains. Bones preserve shape. DNA, when it survives, preserves some genetic clues, but faces, skin tones, hair shades, and the full range of variation inside extinct populations remain partly obscured. What survives in the record suggests only glimpses, not complete portraits. The story begins with ancient DNA, the tool that has transformed the study of human prehistory more than almost any other. Once researchers learned how to extract and analyze fragments of genetic material from fossil bones, the dead stopped being silent in the old way. They still left enormous gaps, but now they could answer some questions that skull shape alone never could. Among those questions was pigmentation. In the case of Neanderthals, researchers identified a particular variant in the MC1R gene that appears to reduce receptor function in a way broadly similar to some variants associated with red hair and fair skin in modern humans. This was a remarkable finding because it suggested that a known pigmentation pathway had also shifted another human lineage. Yet the variant found in Neanderthals was not the same as the common modern human variants associated with red hair. It was a different mutation reaching a somewhat similar functional result. That detail matters enormously. It means the appearance of red or reddish pigmentation in Neanderthals, if it occurred, may represent convergent evolution rather than direct shared inheritance. In plain terms, two related human lineages may have arrived at a similar visible outcome through different genetic changes. Evolution often works this way. Under somewhat similar environmental pressures, separate populations can stumble toward overlapping solutions using different routes through the genome. If some Neanderthals had lighter skin or reddish hair, that would not automatically make them the ancestors of modern red-haired humans. It would instead suggest that reduced function pigmentation variants can arise more than once in cold or low UV settings. This is both less dramatic and more scientifically robust than the popular claim that modern redheads are somehow direct Neanderthal relics. The appeal of that popular claim is easy to understand. It offers a deep and exotic ancestry for a visible modern trait. It transforms family inheritance into a connection with a vanished branch of humanity. It makes the mirror feel archaeological. But the evidence does not support such a direct line. Modern humans outside Africa do carry a small proportion of Neanderthal ancestry due to ancient interbreeding after Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia. That much is well established. Yet the specific MC1R variants most strongly associated with red hair in modern Europeans are not simply inherited from the Neanderthal pigmentation variant identified in those studies. The line is not clean. The drama survives in the imagination more than in the genome. Even so, the Neanderthal question remains worth asking, because it broadens the story of red hair beyond our own species and reveals something important about human evolution. It shows that pigmentation systems are flexible and responsive enough that visibly similar traits can emerge in separate lineages under certain conditions. It also reminds us that appearance is not destiny. A Neanderthal with lighter or reddish hair, if such individuals existed, was not a modern redhead in any cultural or biological sense. The resemblance would be partial, not identity. Human beings are always tempted to collapse ancient variation into modern categories, but those categories are too recent and too socially loaded to map neatly onto deep prehistory. To see why, it helps to picture the actual Neanderthal world. These are not medieval northerners or Celtic archetypes with heavy brows. They're a distinct human group shaped by hundreds of thousands of years in Eurasian environments, long before the rise of modern ethnic identities. They endure harsh climates, exploit large game, make sophisticated tools, use fire, care for injured group members, and bury some of their dead. Their bodies are robust, their faces distinctive, their populations relatively small and regionally structured. Over time they disappear, though not all at once, and not without leaving traces in us. If some among them carried lighter pigmentation, that would be one strand in their adaptive story, not a defining essence. It would tell us that pigment mattered in their world too, perhaps in ways parallel to later Homo sapiens, but it would not tell us that they were secretly the first redheads in any modern sense. The phrase first redheads is itself misleading, because it implies a continuity of identity where only continuity of mechanism may exist. Red hair in living humans is not one indivisible historical object passed intact across time. It is a repeated phenotype, a visible outcome produced when certain pigment pathways shift toward pheomelanin. That outcome can arise through multiple variants and multiple histories. If Neanderthals had their own route to something similar, then the mystery becomes larger, not simpler. It suggests that the human family, broadly defined, contains more than one experiment in lighter or reddish pigmentation. The same environmental logic that later makes fair pigmentation viable in some modern populations may already have been acting on other humans much earlier. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, but the pattern points toward a deep relationship between northern environments, melanin regulation, and the recurrent possibility of lighter visible traits. There is also a lesson here in scientific restraint. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it does not tell us everything. Genes associated with pigmentation can suggest probabilities, not exact colours under real lighting on real bodies. The fossil record preserves only a few individuals relative to the full populations that once existed. A variant found in one or a small number of Neanderthal genomes cannot define the whole species. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible reconstruction must admit that incompleteness. Some Neanderthals may have been darker than later artistic depictions assumed. Some may have shown a range of pigmentation depending on region and time. The temptation to standardize them into one look is a modern habit, not a prehistoric reality. This caution becomes especially important because red hair has so often been used in the modern world to build romantic genealogies, attach it to Neanderthals, and the story becomes almost impossible for popular culture to resist. Suddenly the rare colour is not merely unusual, it is ancient in a way that seems to bypass ordinary history altogether. That is exactly the kind of narrative that flourishes online and in fringe speculation. Yet the stronger scientific conclusion is more modest. Neanderthals may have evolved some forms of lighter pigmentation independently. Modern human red hair is primarily associated with variants that arise within Homo sapiens populations and spread through their own demographic histories. Interbreeding between the two species happened. Yes, but the specific trait map is not reducible to that encounter. Still, the encounter matters in another sense. It reminds us that human evolution is not a clean ladder. For a period of time, our ancestors shared Eurasia with other humans. They met them, competed with them, learned from them, and sometimes had children with them. The world in which red hair-associated variants later persist is already a world shaped by contact between lineages. Even traits that do not come directly from Neanderthals must be understood against that broader backdrop of human diversity. Europe and Western Asia were not empty stages waiting for modern people to arrive and invent new appearances. They were already inhabited, already ecologically demanding, already sites where different humans had been negotiating light, cold, and pigment for a very long time. That makes the Neanderthal shadow less a direct ancestry claim, and more a reminder of deep continuity in the problems bodies have had to solve. Light levels matter, pigment matters. Cold environments favour certain trade-offs. Small populations preserve unusual variants. Distinct lineages can arrive at overlapping solutions. The history of red hair sits comfortably within all of those principles without needing a sensational origin myth. In fact, the real gain from the Neanderthal evidence is not that it gives modern red-haired people an exotic label. It is that it expands the scale of the question. The mysterious gene behind red hair no longer belongs only to a recent human story. It belongs to a broader pattern in which the northern human past repeatedly brushes against lighter pigmentation, sometimes in ways that look strangely familiar. And familiarity can mislead. A reddish-haired Neanderthal, if he or she existed, would still belong to a vanished world beyond easy imagination, a world of Pleistocene predators, unstable climates, mobile camps, and kin networks stretched across dangerous land. The trait would not carry modern meanings there. It would not symbolize temperament, nationality, or beauty in the ways later societies imagine. It would simply be one variation among many in a human relative trying to stay alive. That stripping away of symbolism is useful. It reminds us that red hair begins as chemistry before it becomes identity. It begins as a shift in melanin signaling before it becomes a stereotype or a source of pride or ridicule. In the Neanderthal case, we glimpse the chemistry almost naked, unburdened by the later stories. And in that glimpse, the trait appears less magical, but more anciently human. Once that illusion is cleared, the path opens again toward our own species. The question is no longer whether Neanderthals secretly invented red hair for us. They did not. The question is how the variants associated with red hair in Homo sapiens moved through real populations after our own ancestors spread across Eurasia. That story will not be told by fossil cousins alone, but by migration, by the movement of hunter-gatherers, by later farmers, by steppe peoples, by islands and peninsulas, by ancient population mixtures that turn genes into geography. Red hair does not enter history in one place and stay there. it travels unevenly through the great reshuffling of Europe. By the time red hair begins to look like a regional pattern, rather than a scattered biological possibility, Europe is already a continent in motion. Not motion in the modern sense of roads and states and recorded borders, but in the older human sense that matters far more to genes people moving, settling, mixing, retreating, surviving, and carrying their inherited variations into landscapes that never remain still for long. The story of red hair cannot be understood by fixing it to one ancient people and leaving it there. The variants associated with the trait travel through migrations that are layered, repeated, and often only partly visible in the archaeological record. What later appears on a map as a concentration is usually the result of many earlier movements collapsing into one visible outcome. At the end of the last ice age and in the millennia that follow, Europe does not simply fill up once. It is repopulated and reorganized in phases. Hunter-gatherer groups who survive glacial conditions in southern refugia expand northward as the ice retreats and habitable land opens again. Forests spread, rivers change course, coastlines drown as sea levels rise, cutting off territories that had once been connected plains. Doggerland, the great lowland that once linked Britain to continental Europe, slowly disappears beneath the North Sea, taking with it camps, roots, and memories now hidden underwater. In these shifting worlds, genes move with people, but geography keeps rewriting the conditions of that movement. A population can be connected for centuries and then abruptly separated. A corridor of migration can become a coastline. An inland hunting ground can become a marsh or sea. Red hair-associated variants, like all others, travel through these transformations without any awareness that history is narrowing their paths. The earliest post-glacial movements matter because they create the first broad stage on which later European variation will be built. Hunter-gatherers carrying a mixture of ancestral traits spread into different ecological zones, from Atlantic shores to inland forests to northern plains. These people are not a single uniform population, and ancient DNA increasingly shows that even early Europe contains multiple ancestral strands. Some groups remain more isolated. Others exchange mates and technologies over wider distances. Pigmentation during this period is still a complex and evolving picture. The old assumption that all early Europeans looked broadly like later northern populations has largely collapsed. Some Mesolithic groups appear to have combined darker skin pigmentation with lighter eye colour, a reminder that visible traits do not arrive together in tidy packages. Fair skin, light eyes, blonde hair, and red hair do not all emerge as one coordinated northern type. They follow different genetic paths, shaped by different histories. This is one of the strongest reasons why red hair must be tracked carefully, rather than folded into vague assumptions about European appearance. Then comes one of the great turning points in human history, the spread of farming from Anatolia and the Near East into Europe beginning in the Neolithic. This movement is not just about crops and animals, it is about people. Farming populations move into Europe carrying their own genetic backgrounds, their own body chemistries, and their own patterns of inheritance. In some places they mix gradually with hunter-gatherers, in others they may partly replace them. Over time, Europe becomes a mosaic of blended ancestry rather than a preserved hunter-gatherer world. Any trait already present in local populations must now survive contact with entirely new gene pools. Some variants rise in frequency, others dilute. Some reappear in unexpected combinations generations later. Red hair, if present in the broader gene pool by then, does not belong exclusively to either foragers or farmers. It passes through their merging. This is one reason origin stories tied to a single prehistoric lifestyle collapse under scrutiny. There is no stable hunter redhead or farmer redhead civilization carrying the trait intact. What survives in the record suggests instead that Europe's visible traits are assembled through repeated admixture. Genetic ancestry does not line up cleanly with one occupation or one migration event. The red hair-associated variants known today likely move through these layers, sometimes quietly, sometimes concentrated by local conditions, but always as part of a larger reshuffling. By the time later populations form recognizable regional patterns, they are already composites. A second major reshaping follows in the Bronze Age, when populations associated with the Pontic-Caspian steppe expand westward and enter the European story with enormous long-term consequences. These migrations, linked in broad terms to steppe pastoralist ancestry, alter the genetic landscape of much of Europe again. Languages shift, burial traditions change, new social structures emerge, and once more, inherited variants are redistributed. Traits that had been local may spread farther. Traits that had been common in one zone may be diluted by incoming ancestry. In this sense, red hair travels through not one migration history but several, each overprinting the last. Europe is not a canvas painted once. It is a palimpsest, a surface written on repeatedly, where old lines remain under newer ones if one learns how to look. The islands at Europe's edge become especially important in this process, not because they invent red hair, but because they preserve and reshape traits in distinctive ways. Britain and Ireland are not timeless genetic museums, yet geography does give them a particular role. Once sea levels rise and isolation increases, movement becomes more selective. New groups still arrive, sometimes violently, sometimes gradually, but every island population experiences gene flow differently from a large open mainland. Local variants can become more noticeable. Family lines can remain regionally concentrated for longer. The mathematics of inheritance behave differently when movement is constrained by water. This does not explain red hair on its own, but it helps later explain why certain Atlantic regions become so strongly associated with it in the popular imagination. Even on the mainland, however, migration does not distribute traits smoothly. Mountains interrupt contact, dense forests redirect travel. Cultural boundaries harden or soften over time. Marriage patterns determine which lineages mix and which remain relatively local. A variant may remain quiet in one valley and become regionally visible in another. When later historical populations are observed by Roman writers, medieval chroniclers, or early modern travellers, they are seeing the outcome of thousands of years of uneven mixing. Not an untouched remnant of one ancient source, the red-haired warrior of a classical text, the pale northern captive in an imperial record, the fiery-haired saint or king in a medieval painting. These are all late echoes of much older demographic processes. There is also the simple fact that migration does not merely carry genes, it changes the scale at which genes matter. In a very small population, red hair-associated variants may remain trapped within a limited kin network. As populations expand and movement increases, those variants can spread more widely without necessarily becoming common. This is another reason red hair can appear across broad parts of Europe, while remaining concentrated only in certain places. Mobility distributes the capacity. Local history determines where the visible expression becomes most noticeable. No single explanation fully accounts for the map, but migration is essential, because without it the trait would remain a collection of isolated accidents rather than a durable continental pattern. Ancient DNA has sharpened this picture, though it has not solved every piece. Researchers can now trace broad ancestry components and some pigmentation-relevant variants across time, but ancient sampling is uneven, preservation is patchy, and not every region or period is equally visible. Still, the general result is unmistakable. Europe's genetic history is one of repeated admixture rather than pure continuity. Traits associated today with one region may have deeper root spread across several ancestral populations. Red hair fits this pattern perfectly. The modern clustering of the trait does not mean a simple local invention. It means long accumulation, transport, dilution, and reconcentration through migration. This also helps explain why the modern distribution of red hair is simultaneously familiar and deceptive. People associate the trait most strongly with the British Isles, especially Scotland and Ireland, but the relevant variants appear in lower frequencies across a broader sweep of northern and western Europe. They also appear unexpectedly elsewhere because migration never respected later national myths. A family line can carry the variants for centuries outside the regions most publicly linked to the trait. In that sense, the history of red hair is a history of hidden passengers. The visible colour may be rare, but the capacity for it moves quietly through populations that never build their identity around it at all. And that hidden movement has a psychological consequence. When red hair appears in a child in a family or region where it is uncommon, it can feel ancient, surprising, almost like a message from a distant past. In one sense, it is, but not from one past, from many pasts layered together. A Bronze Age migration may carry one component, a Neolithic admixture another, a Mesolithic survival another still. Later Viking, Norman, Gaelic, Anglo-Saxon, or regional medieval mixtures may reshuffle the deck again. By the time a visible red-haired person appears in the present, the pathway behind that appearance may involve millennia of silent transport through carriers who never showed the full trait themselves. What migration reveals, then, is that red hair is not rooted in a single place so much as in a process. It belongs to the continual movement and remixing of human populations under changing environmental conditions. This is why any attempt to pin it to one vanished tribe or heroic people ends up feeling emotionally satisfying but scientifically thin. The gene variants associated with red hair survive because they keep being carried through living populations. Sometimes those populations are expanding, sometimes they're being conquered, sometimes they're crossing seas in skin boats, later in oared vessels, later still in trade networks and war bands. The trait endures because genes do not require a stable homeland. They require only continuity through reproduction. Yet movement alone still does not explain concentration. If migrations spread the relevant variants across much of Europe, why do some places become so much more strongly associated with red hair than others? Why do certain Atlantic populations seem to preserve the trait with unusual visibility? The answer lies not in movement by itself, but in what happens after movement slows in small communities, narrow founding groups, repeated cousin networks, and the strange arithmetic of inheritance when the world becomes local again. Once migration has scattered the necessary genetic variants across broad parts of Europe, the next stage of the mystery unfolds in much smaller worlds, not empires, not sweeping prehistoric expansions, but villages, islands, valleys, peninsulas, and kin networks so local that a few family lines can alter the visible character of a place for centuries. This is where founder effects begin to matter. The phrase sounds technical, but the principle is almost stark in its simplicity. If a small group of people establishes or dominates a community, the genetic variants they happen to carry can become unusually common there. not because those variants are universally superior, but because history has given them an early numerical advantage. A trait that is rare in a larger population can become regionally noticeable in a smaller one for reasons that are partly accidental and only partly adaptive. Red hair, with its dependence on inheritance combinations and its ability to pass quietly through carriers, is exactly the kind of trait that can behave this way. Imagine a coastal settlement founded by a relatively small number of families. They do not know anything about recessive inheritance. They know only that children sometimes resemble grandparents more than parents, that certain features run in particular lineages, and that communities are shaped by who marries whom. If several of those founding individuals carry MC1R variants associated with red hair, the local gene pool begins with a hidden bias. For generations, the trait may appear only occasionally, but the underlying variants remain unusually frequent because the population is small and the marriage network limited. Then, over time, red hair seems to appear more often than expected. To outsiders, this may look like something essential about the place itself, as though the land produces the colour. In reality, the land has preserved a pattern that began with a handful of ancestors and the narrow mathematics of descent. This is one of the most powerful forces in population genetics, and one of the easiest for everyday intuition to miss. People tend to assume that common features in a region must have arisen there because they belong there. But founder effects say otherwise. A region may look distinctive simply because a small initial group happened to carry a particular set of variants. Once that happens, isolation can magnify the effect. Mountains, islands, poor roads, strong local marriage customs, linguistic boundaries, religious divisions, or sheer distance can all reduce outside gene flow. The smaller and more stable the community, the more history begins to echo through inheritance. A rare trait has room to become visible without ever becoming universal. This helps explain why red hair can seem so strongly linked to certain regions, while still remaining uncommon in absolute terms. The trait does not need to dominate a population in order to become part of its reputation. It only needs to appear often enough to be memorable. A founder effect can produce exactly that level of visibility. A few percent here, a notable cluster there, several prominent families in another district, and gradually a broader cultural impression forms. The modern observer then mistakes impression for totality. A place becomes known for red hair even though most people there do not have it. The power of the stereotype rests on concentration, not majority. Bottlenecks intensify the same process from another direction. A bottleneck occurs when a population is drastically reduced in size, often through famine, disease, warfare, climate disaster, migration, or some combination of them. When only a subset survives, the future gene pool is built disproportionately from their traits. Variants that were once rare can rise sharply if enough survivors carry them. Variants that were once common can disappear. This is not evolution in the grand cinematic sense of superior forms conquering inferior ones. It is statistical survival under catastrophe. Human history is full of such episodes, especially in difficult environments. Repeated bottlenecks in Atlantic or northern communities could have played a quiet but important role in preserving and amplifying red hair-associated variants. The crucial point is that founder effects and bottlenecks do not require a trait to be useful. They require only that it travel with survivors. This makes them especially valuable for explaining red hair, because the trait's rarity suggests that direct selection alone is probably not enough. If red hair had a powerful universal advantage, it would likely be more widespread. If it carried a severe disadvantage everywhere, it would likely have disappeared. Instead, it occupies a middle space, and that middle space is exactly where demographic accidents have the most room to operate. A variant that is mildly tolerated can become regionally prominent if population history keeps narrowing and restarting the pool. Island communities offer some of the clearest examples of how this works, though they are not unique. An island does not have to be completely cut off to behave differently from the mainland. Even limited barriers to movement can matter over centuries. Maritime travel may bring new people, but not in the same steady volume as open overland movement across a large continent. This creates a pattern of periodic mixing instead of constant mixing. Traits can linger. Family lines can remain locally important. If a red hair-associated variant enters such a setting early enough, especially through multiple carriers, it can remain alive with unusual visibility. Similar dynamics can occur in inland valleys or culturally bounded rural regions where movement is constrained in other ways. What makes red hair particularly sensitive to these dynamics is that the visible phenotype can remain hidden for long stretches while the relevant variants accumulate in carriers. In a small population, that means the potential for red hair can build quietly. 2 carriers marry, then 2 more generations later, another pair, and suddenly a cluster appears. To local memory, this may feel sudden, but genetically it has been prepared over decades or centuries. The hiddenness of the variants allows the founder effect to deepen before the visible trait announces itself. By the time outsiders notice, the local gene pool may already be unusually rich in the combinations required. This also helps explain why oral traditions and regional identity can become so convinced that a visible trait is ancient. In a real sense, it often is. Not ancient because it was born from the soil, or because one tribe remained pure, but ancient because the same narrow descent lines have been recombining in one place for a very long time. A local population can preserve a trait through continuity, even while the wider world changes repeatedly around it. Empires rise, languages shift, religions come and go, yet a small set of inherited variants keeps resurfacing in children who grow up hearing that their hair marks them as belonging to the place. Biology and identity begin to reinforce each other, even though they began for different reasons. There is, however, a danger in overusing founder effects as a total explanation. They are powerful, but they do not create variants from nothing. The relevant genetic changes must already be present, nor do founder effects act alone forever. No population remains perfectly isolated across millennia. Trade, invasion, marriage, mobility, and social change all introduce new gene flow. A founder effect can establish a regional pattern, but later history can soften, complicate, or strengthen it depending on what happens next. This is why regions associated with red hair today are not genetic time capsules. They are products of both early concentration and subsequent history. The evidence remains incomplete on the exact balance in every case, but the general mechanism is clear enough to matter. Another useful concept here is genetic drift, the gradual change in variant frequencies due not to selection, but to random fluctuations across generations. In very large populations, drift tends to be slow and often drowned out by other forces. In small populations, it can be dramatic. A few more surviving children in one lineage, a few fewer in another, and the gene pool shifts. Red hair-associated variants may therefore drift upward in some communities without any direct adaptive story behind them. This is not especially romantic, but it is deeply human. So much of history depends on chance made permanent through inheritance. A storm sinks one boat and not another. One family survives an epidemic. One marriage happens, another does not. Centuries later, the consequences are still visible in something as intimate as hair colour. The modern mind often resists this because chance feels unsatisfying. People prefer neat explanations with purpose, but founder effects and drift are part of the ordinary machinery of population history. They explain why some rare diseases cluster in certain communities, why some surnames dominate particular villages, why certain facial features seem local, and why unusual pigmentation can become a regional hallmark without ever being globally common. Red hair fits naturally into this pattern. It is not random in the sense of being uncaused, but its regional concentrations may owe as much to the random survival of carriers in small populations as to any grand adaptive design. This understanding also softens one of the most common misconceptions that a region with many red-haired people must have remained genetically unchanged for thousands of years. The opposite can be true. A region can experience repeated migration and still preserve or even amplify the trait if incoming populations mix with local carriers in particular ways. Founder effects do not freeze history. They simply give it a starting imbalance. Everything afterward works on that imbalance, sometimes preserving it, sometimes diluting it, sometimes making it suddenly visible again. What survives in the record suggests precisely this kind of layered continuity in parts of Atlantic Europe. The trait becomes noticeable not because history stopped there, but because enough of the relevant variants kept surviving each new chapter. There is something almost eerie about this when viewed at the scale of generations. A trait that no one chooses and few fully understand can remain present in a community because of decisions made long ago by people who never knew what they were transmitting. A marriage made for land, alliance, affection, necessity, or simple proximity becomes one more thread in a pattern that outlasts memory. Children are born into a world where their appearance seems local and familiar, while the genetic logic behind it has been accumulating silently since before the village church, before the local dialect, before the state that now claims the land. Red hair, in this sense, can be a fossil of social geography as much as of evolutionary history. By now the trait begins to look less like a mystery of origin and more like a mystery of preservation. The gene variants associated with red hair emerge, survive broader environmental pressures, travel through migration, and then lodge themselves unevenly in small worlds where founder effects and bottlenecks give them unusual staying power. This does not yet explain why some places become famous for the trait, while others with similar histories do not. Fame is another layer entirely, built from outsiders' observations, internal identity, and cultural repetition. But the demographic groundwork is now in place. Once a rare trait becomes regionally visible, the world begins to attach stories to it. Some of those stories become so persistent that they overshadow the underlying biology. That is exactly what happens next. Over time, certain regions on the Atlantic fringe, above all Scotland and Ireland in the popular imagination, become emblematic of red hair itself. The science behind that association is real, but incomplete. The symbolism built on top of it is often much larger than the numbers. To understand why, the story has to move from genetics to identity, from inheritance to reputation, and from local demography to the making of national myths. By the time red hair becomes strongly associated with Scotland and Ireland, the biology is already old. The variants behind the trait have moved through prehistory, survived bottlenecks, crossed with other ancestries, and settled unevenly into local populations long before modern national identities emerge. Yet the human mind is not satisfied with hidden accumulation. It wants symbols, faces, places. It wants to look at a map and feel that a trait belongs somewhere. And so, The Atlantic fringe, especially the western and northern reaches of the British Isles, gradually becomes not just a region where red hair appears relatively often, but the region where many people imagine it properly lives. That transformation is only partly genetic. The rest is history, storytelling, and the immense power of repeated cultural association. The scientific foundation is real enough. Red hair does occur at relatively higher frequencies in parts of Scotland and Ireland than in most of the world, and those populations also show elevated frequencies of the genetic variants most often associated with the trait. But here again the numbers need care. Even in the places most famous for it, red hair is not the majority condition. Most people in Scotland do not have red hair. Most people in Ireland do not have red hair. Yet the image persists with extraordinary strength, as though the trait were almost national uniform. This gap between prevalence and reputation is one of the most revealing parts of the story. It shows how a visible minority trait can become symbolic once it appears often enough to be memorable, especially when outsiders are primed to notice it. Part of that priming comes from contrast. For much of European history, travellers, invaders, chroniclers, and later ethnographers are fascinated by difference at the edges of their familiar world. Peripheral regions, whether geographically remote or politically marginal, are often described in exaggerated physical terms. The people there are taller, stranger, fiercer, paler, darker, hairier, more primitive, more ancient, or more beautiful depending on the observer's mood and agenda. Physical description becomes a way of turning geography into character. Scotland and Ireland, seen through outside eyes across classical, medieval, and early modern writing, are especially vulnerable to this kind of treatment. The farther a people seem from imperial or metropolitan centres, the easier it becomes to assign them a dramatic look and call it essence. Red hair fits this process perfectly because it is both visible and uncommon. An observer does not need statistical data to come away with a strong impression. A handful of striking individuals can shape memory more powerfully than hundreds of less remarkable ones. A red-haired warrior, queen, saint, peasant, rebel, or noble catches the eye and stays in the account. Over time, those impressions accumulate. They circulate through literature, portraiture, political satire, travel writing, romantic nationalism, and eventually modern media. The trait becomes shorthand. Scotland is imagined through tartan, mist, heather, and red hair. Ireland through pale faces, wind, folklore, freckled skin, and copper tones. By then the image has moved beyond genetics into national iconography. This is where the distinction between frequency and symbolism becomes crucial. A region does not become famous for a trait merely because the trait is statistically present. It becomes famous when the trait harmonizes with a larger story people want to tell about the region. Red hair does this unusually well in the British Isles because it complements a whole set of already circulating ideas: marginality, antiquity, fierce independence, clan memory, storm-swept landscapes, and supposed survival from some older Europe. Many of these narratives are romantic simplifications. Some are shaped by colonial attitudes, some by nationalist self-fashioning, some by the 19th century's obsessive tendency to turn visible physical traits into clues about race and destiny. Red hair slips easily into all of them because it looks ancient even when it is simply inherited. The irony is that the actual genetic history of the British Isles is anything but pure or isolated. These islands have seen repeated waves of migration, contact, conquest, and admixture, Mesolithic foragers, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age populations shaped by steppe ancestry. Later movements associated with Celtic-speaking cultures, Roman influence in Britain, Anglo-Saxon settlement, Norse expansion, Norman conquest, and countless more local and regional mixtures. Ireland and Scotland are no less layered. Their populations preserve continuity. Yes, but never untouched continuity. Red hair, therefore, cannot be the relic of one unbroken tribal essence. It survives through a long sequence of mixtures, just as it does elsewhere. The association is real, but the myth of purity built around it is not. And yet myths do not need purity to thrive. They need emotional clarity. The image of the red-haired Scot or Irishman is emotionally clear in a way the real demographic story is not. It compresses centuries of population history into a face that seems instantly readable. That is why art and media have reinforced it so strongly. 19th century romantic paintings, nationalist revivals, early photography, tourism imagery, film casting, and commercial branding all help turn a minority trait into a symbolic one. Once the association is established, it begins to feed itself. Viewers expect red hair in depictions of these places, so creators include it more often. The region becomes more visually red-haired in imagination than in reality. Symbolism outruns the statistics. There is also the effect of regional clustering within the broader national picture. Certain districts, islands, or local communities may show the trait more often than surrounding areas due to the founder effects and local histories already shaping the story. Outsiders rarely perceive this fine detail. They generalize upward. A striking pattern in one area becomes a stereotype for the whole nation. This is a familiar process in cultural geography. A coastal custom becomes how a people live. A regional dish becomes their food. A visible trait in one province becomes their appearance. By the time the generalization hardens, it can be very difficult to dislodge even with better data. The popularity of linking red hair to so-called Celtic identity also needs careful handling. The term Celtic itself carries layers of linguistic, archaeological, and political complexity, and modern popular usage often turns it into a racial category it was never designed to be. People speak as if red hair were a Celtic marker in the blood, a visual inheritance from some ancient and unified Celtic people. The evidence does not support such neatness. Celtic-speaking societies were diverse, mobile, and historically interconnected with many neighbouring populations. Language and genes do not map perfectly onto one another, and physical traits never belong cleanly to linguistic categories. Red hair may be somewhat more visible in regions later associated with Gaelic or other Celtic-speaking traditions, but that does not make it an ethnic signature in any pure biological sense. Scholars still debate how strongly cultural identity and local genetic clustering interact in different historical regions, and the safer conclusion is always the less romantic one: overlap exists, but essence does not. Even the climate imagery attached to Scotland and Ireland deepens the symbolism. Low light, cloud cover, rain, green landscapes, and pale Atlantic skies all seem to match the look of red hair in the public imagination. The trait appears visually at home there. Copper and auburn against mist or heather feels almost narratively correct to later viewers, as if the landscape and the body belong to the same palette. This is not science, but it matters because cultural associations are often strengthened by aesthetics. A colour that seems to fit a place becomes easier to remember as belonging to it. In literature and film, the red-haired figure in an Atlantic setting can feel less like one person among many and more like the place made human. There is, however, a more grounded reason the British Isles became such enduring symbols in this story. Their populations are large enough and historically visible enough for the trait to be publicly noticed, But their island geography also preserves some of the demographic conditions that allow regional frequencies to remain relatively elevated. They are not sealed worlds, but neither are they fully open continental corridors. That middle condition matters. It allows traits to persist with some local distinctiveness while still entering written history, imperial record, and global imagination. A similarly high concentration in a more obscure or historically marginalised micropopulation might never have become iconic. Scotland and Ireland become symbols partly because they are demographically suitable and narratively visible at the same time. Once the symbolism is established, it begins shaping identity from within as well as from outside. People notice the trait in their families, local humour forms around it, pride and teasing coexist, political caricatures exaggerate it, diaspora communities carry the image abroad. Red hair becomes a recognisable shorthand in the storytelling of national belonging, even for people who do not possess it themselves. This is one of the curious things about identity. A visible minority trait can become representative because it is distinctive enough to stand for the whole. It condenses difference into something that can be recognized instantly. The deeper biology is forgotten. The symbol remains. And yet beneath the symbol, the same old truth continues. Most red-haired people in these populations are not living fossils of a separate race. They are the ordinary descendants of many migrations, many marriages, and many centuries of recombination. Their hair looks dramatic because the trait is rare, not because it comes from outside humanity's usual processes. The British Isles did not create red hair from nothing. They preserved and made visible a trait already moving through the broader human story. That visibility, once noticed, became reputation. Reputation then became myth. The result is one of the strongest examples in human history of how a real biological pattern can be enlarged into cultural shorthand. Scotland and Ireland are genuinely important to the modern distribution of red hair, but they are not its single cradle, nor its sole meaning, nor its complete explanation. They are the places where demography, geography, visibility, and narrative happen to align most powerfully. That alignment gave the world an emblem, but the emblem is not the whole record. It is only one chapter in the life of a trait that is older, more scattered, and more complicated than national imagination prefers to admit. And once a trait becomes emblematic, it rarely remains biologically neutral in the public mind. People begin to attach temperament to it, destiny to it, danger to it, beauty to it. The leap from concentration to meaning is small and ancient. Red hair, because it is visible, rare, and already wrapped in place, becomes a perfect target for that leap. Before long it is no longer just a colour carried by genes. It becomes a sign read by culture, and culture, as always, reads far more into the body than the body ever intended to say. Once red hair becomes visible enough to attract notice, it stops being merely inherited and starts being interpreted. This is one of the oldest habits in human societies. A physical trait stands out, and instead of leaving it alone as variation, people turn it into character. Hair, perhaps more than any other visible feature, invites this treatment because it sits at the edge of the face, changes with age and light, and can be seen from a distance before any word is spoken. Red hair intensifies that effect. It is uncommon enough to feel marked, vivid enough to remain memorable, and unstable enough in different lighting to seem almost to shift its own mood. Once that happens, folklore begins to gather around it like iron filings around a magnet. Some of those stories admire it, some fear it, many do both at once. In different societies and periods, red hair has been made to signify opposite things with equal confidence. It has been associated with beauty and with disorder, nobility and treachery, erotic appeal and spiritual danger, foreignness and ancestral purity, luck and misfortune. That contradiction is itself revealing. It shows that the trait does not carry fixed meaning. Culture projects onto it whatever a given time and place most wants to dramatize. A visible rarity becomes a canvas. The same hair that one society reads as fiery and desirable, another may read as untrustworthy or excessive. No single explanation fully accounts for these reversals because they are not biological at all. They are social responses to conspicuous difference. The ancient Mediterranean offers some early examples of how this works. Classical writers notice unusual hair colours in peoples beyond their own familiar regions, and often describe them in ways that blend observation with stereotype. Northern and Western populations are sometimes imagined as larger, fiercer, or less civilized, and striking hair becomes part of that portrait. Yet admiration is never far away. Unusual colouring can also be exotic, compelling, or visually elevated in art. The body of the outsider is both marked and aestheticized. This pattern continues for centuries. Difference is turned into narrative. Hair becomes shorthand for temperament before anyone has the tools to separate heredity from imagination. In medieval Europe, the symbolic field grows even denser. Christian moral frameworks, local folklore, inherited classical assumptions, and everyday village suspicion all mingle together. Physical difference, especially if unpredictable within families, easily becomes morally charged. A visible trait that does not fit the local norm invites explanation, and pre-modern explanation often reaches first for allegory. Red hair can be linked to fire, and fire is never only one thing. It is warmth, light, hearth, life, but also destruction, temptation, wrath, hell, and judgment. Once those symbolic associations attach themselves to the body, the person wearing the trait may be read through them whether fairly or not. A red-haired figure in art or story can become quick-tempered, sensual, dangerous, uncanny, or spiritually ambiguous not because any evidence supports it, but because the colour already comes with metaphor attached. This is also where suspicion enters. In some traditions, unusual hair becomes a convenient signal for outsiders, tricksters, witches, or morally unstable figures. Such associations are rarely universal, and they vary greatly by region. But the broad pattern appears again and again. Rarity invites moral storytelling. If most people do not share a trait, it becomes easier to use that trait as a marker for difference in tales that need memorable villains or disruptive figures. The evidence remains incomplete on how widely such beliefs were held in everyday life compared with literary or clerical settings. But what survives in the record suggests that red hair could be burdened with negative meanings far beyond its biological reality. And yet admiration persists alongside suspicion so consistently that the trait never settles into one moral category. In poetry, legend, and portraiture, reddish or golden red hair can signal beauty, high status, vivid vitality, or a kind of dangerous magnetism. That magnetism matters because rare visible features often become attractive precisely because they are unusual. What stands out can be feared, but it can also be desired. Courts, noble lineages, and artistic traditions sometimes elevate the trait rather than stigmatize it. In later centuries, painters frequently exploit auburn and copper hair because it catches light and gives the face presence. The visual arts understand instinctively what folklore had long known in another register red hair is hard to ignore. This doubleness may explain why the cultural history of red hair feels so unstable. Unlike traits that are simply normalized or simply stigmatized, red hair is repeatedly pulled in both directions. It is admired for the very reasons it is distrusted. It is memorable, and memory can tilt either toward fascination or unease. In village life, a child with striking hair may be teased, praised, singled out, or all three. In literature, the same visible colour can make a heroine seem radiant or a villain seem corrupted. Modern stereotypes about temperament, sexuality, stubbornness, volatility, and specialness all inherit some part of this older ambiguity. They feel trivial now in many settings, but their roots are deep. They come from long habits of reading the body as a clue to inner nature. That habit has always been flawed. Physical traits do not reveal character, yet humans persist in acting as if they do. Red hair becomes one of the clearest case studies in this era because it is rare enough to seem meaningful, but common enough to remain socially present. A trait seen only once in a lifetime becomes legend. A trait seen constantly becomes background. Red hair occupies the unstable space in between. It is frequent enough to keep returning and rare enough to keep provoking interpretation. That is almost the perfect formula for myth-making. There is another reason the myths grow so easily. Red hair does not only differ from darker shades, it often appears to glow. In certain light it can seem almost illuminated from within, especially against pale skin or muted landscapes. Pre-modern people, no less observant than modern ones, would have noticed this immediately. In a world lit by sun, fire, and candle rather than electric bulbs, such optical effects may have seemed even more dramatic. The trait did not merely signify difference. It performed it. It changed under weather and light in ways that made it feel animate. A feature that appears to shift its own intensity invites symbolic explanation more readily than one that remains visually constant. Popular religion and superstition also magnified these readings. In many societies, uncommon bodily traits of all kinds became entangled with ideas of fate, blessing, sin, or magic. Red hair was only one among many markers people could misread this way, but its visibility made it especially useful. A community under stress often seeks signs. A crop fails, an illness spreads, an outsider arrives, a dispute deepens, and someone visibly unusual becomes easier to place at the edge of trust. It would be wrong to claim that red-haired people were universally targeted in any systematic sense across Europe or beyond. The history is far too varied for that. But local suspicion, teasing, exclusion, or fascination certainly attached to the trait in different times and places. What survives in the record suggests more social volatility than stable prejudice. Yet volatility itself can shape lived experience. Then comes the modern period, which does not end the myth so much as repackage them. Enlightenment classification, 19th century racial thinking, romantic nationalism, and later mass media all take turns using red hair as a sign of something larger than itself. Pseudoscientific theories try to attach it to race types. Nationalist movements fold it into idealized images of local ancestry. Stage performance and film turn it into a personality code. Advertising turns it into distinction. Schoolyard jokes turn it into vulnerability. Fashion turns it into allure. Even in an age of genetics, the old symbolic reflex survives. People still ask what red hair means, as though the colour were a message rather than a pigment outcome shaped by inheritance. The persistence of those meanings reveals something uncomfortable about human social life. We are not content to let visible variation remain neutral. We continuously sort bodies into narratives, assigning moral or emotional qualities based on surface cues. Red hair has simply provided an unusually durable target for that process because it is uncommon, recognizable, and old. The science may now explain the pigment system and the genetics with far more precision than any earlier age could manage. But explanation does not automatically dissolve symbolism. In some ways, it even feeds it. Once a trait is known to be genetically distinctive, people may feel newly licensed to imagine that it marks some deeper essence, even when the science says the opposite. And the science does say the opposite. There's no evidence that red hair determines temperament, intelligence, willpower, virtue, danger, or destiny. The trait is real, inherited, and biologically meaningful in the narrow sense that it reflects pigment pathways. Beyond that, culture does the heavy lifting. Every legend attached to red hair is a human response to visibility, not a property of the trait itself. Yet those responses matter historically because they influence how red-haired people are treated, depicted, desired, mocked, remembered, and mythologized. The body supplies the variation, society writes the script. There is almost a paradox here. The more ordinary the biology of red hair becomes under scientific scrutiny, the more extraordinary its cultural life appears. At the cellular level, it is a shift in melanin balance. At the social level, it has been made into a sign of temperament, sexuality, rebellion, saintliness, sorcery, foreign blood, old ancestry, and artistic beauty. Few traits reveal the gap between biological fact and cultural meaning so clearly. That gap is part of the mystery too, though not the genetic mystery. It is the mystery of why humans insist on turning visible difference into story even when story outruns truth. Still, some stories do not arise from pure imagination. They grow partly from recurring lived experience, from how bodies interact with the world in ways people can notice, even if they do not understand the mechanism. Red hair has been burdened with myth. Yes, but it is also linked to certain real physiological patterns that may have helped keep it socially conspicuous. The tendency to burn easily, the frequent presence of freckles, the unusual response to sunlight, and even differences in pain perception have all contributed to the sense that red-haired bodies behave a little differently. Here the trail leaves folklore and enters another, more delicate territory, the body beyond the hair itself. For most of history, red hair has been treated as though it were a message written on the outside of the body. In reality, the body does not stop at the hair. The same pigment pathways that make a strand emerge copper, rust, or strawberry gold often shape other aspects of appearance and physiology as well. This is where the story becomes more delicate, because modern science can identify patterns, but not every popular claim about red-haired bodies survives scrutiny. Some do. Some are exaggerated, some remain unsettled. The result is a field of half-known truths that has only deepened the sense that red hair carries more biological consequences than a simple colour should. The best established companion traits are the visible ones. Many naturally red-haired people also have fairer skin, lighter freckling patterns, and a reduced ability to tan deeply. These are not random additions. They arise from the same broad shift in pigment production, already tracing its way through the story. If the body favours pheomelanin over eumelanin, the effect is not confined neatly to the scalp. Skin may contain less of the darker protective pigment that helps shield against ultraviolet radiation. Instead of tanning evenly, pigment may cluster in small spots, producing freckles where sun exposure stimulates local melanin production, but not the kind of broad, even darkening seen in other skin types. The body is still responding to light. It is simply doing so under a different set of inherited instructions. That different response has practical consequences. Fair-skinned, red-haired individuals often burn more quickly under strong sunlight, and repeated ultraviolet damage increases the risk of skin injury and, over time, skin cancer. This is one of the clearest biological trade-offs attached to the trait. In dim northern climates, very fair pigmentation may have been tolerable or sometimes advantageous in relation to vitamin D production. In stronger sunlight, the same reduced protection becomes a liability. The old environmental story remains written into the modern body. A trait that persists because it's survived under one set of conditions does not become universally safe in all others. Evolution rarely offers gift without cost. This is part of why red-haired bodies have remained medically interesting. Researchers have long noticed that certain physiological patterns appear somewhat more often among people carrying MC1R variants associated with red hair, especially those with the more strongly expressed phenotype. One of the most discussed involves pain sensitivity and responses to anesthesia. Some studies suggest that red-haired individuals, on average, may respond differently to certain anesthetic agents or pain stimuli than people without these variants. The details are complicated and not always consistent across all studies or all forms of pain. Some evidence points toward greater sensitivity in certain contexts and altered requirements for anesthesia in others. Scholars still debate how large and clinically uniform these effects really are. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to turn a statistical tendency into a rule for every person. But the pattern has been credible enough to attract serious medical attention rather than remaining a folk rumour. What makes this especially intriguing is that MC1R is known primarily as a pigmentation gene. Yet the body is not organised into perfectly separate compartments. A gene that changes signalling in one visible pathway may also interact indirectly with broader neurochemical systems. Researchers have proposed links between melanocortin pathways and pain processing, which may help explain why some red-haired individuals show unusual responses in laboratory or clinical settings. The science here is technical and still evolving, but the larger lesson is simple traits we think of as superficial often share molecular roots with processes that are anything but superficial. A visible colour can be the public face of deeper biological variation. There are other recurring claims as well. Some studies have examined whether red-haired individuals bruise differently, bleed differently, respond differently to temperature, or show distinctive patterns in immune or inflammatory response. A few lines of evidence have suggested differences in pain threshold or thermal sensitivity, but the findings are not always robust or uniform enough to justify sweeping conclusions. Popular culture tends to flatten uncertain science into catchy truths, and red hair has been a frequent victim of that flattening. Once the trait is culturally marked as unusual, every tentative physiological observation gets absorbed into the myth that red-haired people are biologically exceptional in every direction. That is not what the evidence supports. What survives in the record suggests a handful of real associations, especially around pigmentation and perhaps some aspects of pain response, embedded in a much wider field of exaggeration. The link with skin cancer risk, by contrast, is more straightforward. People with very fair skin and reduced tanning capacity are more vulnerable to ultraviolet damage, and many naturally red-haired individuals fall into that category. The exact degree of risk varies with skin tone, geography, sun behaviour, and family history, but the overall direction is clear. Here again the body carries the memory of ancient trade-offs into a very different modern world. A pigmentation pattern that may once have fit cloudy northern conditions now exists under global mobility, outdoor leisure, artificial tanning norms, and travel into intense sunlight far from the environments in which the traits' associated variants persisted. The gene remains old, the lifestyle becomes new, the mismatch can be dangerous. Even within the trait, variation matters. Not all red-haired people are equally fair, equally freckled, or equally sun-sensitive. Some tan a little, some almost not at all. Some have vivid orange copper hair with nearly translucent skin. Others have darker auburn hair and less obvious freckling. The same broad phenotype contains real diversity, which means medical generalizations must always be handled with caution. A doctor cannot assume everything from appearance alone. A culture certainly should not. The tendency to essentialize red-haired bodies is just another version of the older mistake of reading too much into visible difference. There is also the question of whether red hair correlates with other health conditions more broadly. This is where caution matters most, because the trait is distinctive and genetically interesting. Researchers have sometimes tested associations with many outcomes, from neurological conditions to reproductive differences to chronic pain syndromes. Some findings are suggestive, others fade under larger or better controlled study. The history of medical research is full of patterns that looked meaningful at first and then weakened. Red hair, precisely because it attracts attention, can invite overinterpretation. No single explanation fully accounts for every reported association, and the safest conclusion is that some real physiological tendencies likely exist, especially where pigmentation and melanocortin pathways are directly involved. But the trait does not define a separate medical category of person. That distinction matters socially as much as scientifically. Once a population trait becomes culturally charged, people are eager for biological facts that seem to validate old intuitions. If folklore says red-haired people are somehow different, even strange, then every study about pain response or skin sensitivity can be misread as proof that the folklore was right all along. It was not. The existence of a few genuine physiological correlations does not rescue the myths about temperament, morality, or destiny. It simply shows that genes affecting pigment can have broader biological echoes. Those echoes are part of being human. Many traits do this. They only seem especially dramatic in the case of red hair because the trait itself has spent so long under public scrutiny. Freckles deserve their own moment in this story because they are one of the most visible signs that pigment is being distributed differently. In many red-haired individuals, freckles become a kind of map of the skin's uneven response to sunlight. They are not a separate condition dropped randomly onto the body, but another expression of the pigmentation system operating with reduced eumelanin protection and localized pigment activity. Historically, freckles have sometimes been mocked, romanticized, or treated as childlike, but biologically they belong to the same ancient negotiation between skin and light. In strong sun, they mark exposure. In weak light, they may soften into near invisibility. Like red hair itself, they are an old evolutionary compromise turned into a social symbol. There is something quietly revealing in all of this. The body associated with red hair has never been just one thing. It is not merely decorated differently. It often encounters the environment differently. It receives sunlight differently, records it differently, and perhaps in some cases experiences pain and anesthesia somewhat differently. None of this makes the body alien or anomalous. It makes it specific. Human variation is full of such specificity. Lactose tolerance, altitude adaptation, malaria resistance, earwax type, sweat gland activity, alcohol metabolism, and countless other traits remind us that there is no single human default. Red hair belongs to that broader truth. It is one of the more visible reminders that inherited differences can extend beyond the surface without becoming destiny. This is also where the old cultural instinct partially overlaps with real observation, though only partially. People in the past may have noticed that some red-haired individuals burned badly in the sun, freckled in unusual ways, or reacted differently to physical discomfort. Without genetics or clinical science, they folded those observations into folklore. The folklore then amplified and distorted them until they bore little relation to biology. Modern science, arriving much later, has peeled some of that back and found a small core of truth inside the exaggeration. That happens often in the history of the body. Human beings notice patterns before they know how to explain them. The danger comes when explanation never catches up and myth takes permanent control. Red hair, then, reveals something important about the gap between phenotype and identity. A visible trait can be associated with real physiological tendencies without justifying a social category built around essence. The body may behave somewhat differently under certain conditions, but that does not make it a separate kind of human. It makes it a variant within the species, one shaped by old pigment pathways and preserved through a long history of adaptation, chance, and migration. The modern study of red hair is strongest when it stays at that level precise, limited, attentive to evidence, and skeptical of grand claims. And once the noise of folklore is stripped away, what remains is perhaps even more compelling than the myths. Red hair is not interesting because it proves that some people are fundamentally unlike others. It is interesting because it offers scientists a visible doorway into how inheritance, environment, and physiology intersect. A trait easy to recognize from across the room turns out to be connected to pigment chemistry, ultraviolet trade-offs, gene regulation, and possibly broader signaling pathways. That makes it far more than a curiosity. It makes it a tool, a clue, a small bright marker that helps researchers ask larger questions about human variation itself. The mystery now begins to widen again. Red hair is no longer only a story about one trait surviving prehistory or gathering folklore. It becomes a case study in how scientists reconstruct the past from the present, how they move from a visible characteristic to genetic mechanisms, from genetic mechanisms to ancient environments, and from ancient environments back to the long, unfinished story of human evolution. The colour in the hair matters, but even more important is what that colour allows us to see. By this point, red hair has ceased to be a curiosity and become something more useful, a visible entrance into the deeper machinery of human variation. Few traits make that transition so well. Most of the body's evolutionary history is hidden from casual sight. It survives in immune responses, digestive enzymes, fat metabolism, altitude tolerance, fertility patterns, or microscopic changes in bone and blood that no one notices in ordinary life. Red hair is different. It announces itself immediately, and because it does, it offers scientists an unusually clear way to connect appearance with genes, genes with environment, and environment with history. It is not the most important human trait, nor the most consequential, but it is one of the easiest to trace from the visible surface down into the unseen logic beneath. That makes it valuable far beyond the question of why some people have copper hair and others do not. Red hair helps reveal how evolution often works in humans not as a simple march toward perfection, but as a layered process of mutation, inheritance, environmental pressure, demographic accident, and cultural reinterpretation. Every part of that process is present here. A mutation alters pigment signaling. The body shifts toward pheomelanin. The trait survives under some environmental conditions better than others. It moves through migrating populations. It becomes more visible in some regions through founder effects and bottlenecks. Then culture seizes on it and assigns meanings that biology never intended. In one compact story, the entire human pattern appears adaptation mixed with chance, then wrapped in myth. Scientists prize traits like this because they can be studied from multiple angles at once. Genetics can identify relevant variants, especially in and around MC1R and other pigmentation pathways. Biochemistry can explain how the pigment balance shifts. Anthropology can situate that shift in terms of climate, migration, and population structure. Medicine can investigate related physiological patterns such as sun sensitivity or anesthesia response. Archaeology can provide the changing landscapes through which the variants moved. Ancient DNA can test which populations carried what combinations at particular times, even if the record remains incomplete. A single visible feature becomes a meeting point for several disciplines that do not always overlap so neatly. That is rare. Red hair is therefore not merely a trait to be explained. It is an instrument for explaining other things. It is also a corrective to the way many people still imagine evolution. Popular thought often treats evolution as though it produces only large, dramatic transformations: upright walking, enlarged brains, language, skin color, the spread of farming, resistance to disease. Those things matter, but so do smaller visible outcomes that show how constantly the body's being adjusted by history. Red hair demonstrates that evolution can preserve a rare trait without making it universal, can tolerate diversity without resolving it into one winner, and can leave behind variation that is conditional rather than absolute. A trait does not have to conquer the world to matter evolutionarily. It only has to survive long enough to reveal something about the pressures and pathways shaping the species. This is one reason red hair is such a useful antidote to simplistic racial thinking. The history of the trait refuses clean boundaries. It is associated today with certain regions, yet it does not belong exclusively to them. It is tied strongly to specific genetic variants. Yet those variants can exist without obvious visible expression. It emerges within broader patterns of fair pigmentation, yet it does not accompany every light-skinned population. It appears ancient, yet its visible modern distribution is shaped by comparatively recent demographic history, as well as deep prehistory. Every attempt to turn red hair into proof of a pure people, a singular bloodline, or a biologically sealed identity collapses under the actual evidence. In that sense, the trait teaches one of the most important lessons in human biology. Visible features are real, but the stories people build around them are often much neater than the inheritance ever was. The trait also reveals the scale at which human evolution remains unfinished. That does not mean red hair is newly evolving in some dramatic modern sense, or that people are about to diversify into clear biological castes. It means only that human populations continue to carry and redistribute variation all the time. Evolution is not a prehistoric event that ended when civilization began. It persists wherever genes are inherited under changing conditions. Migration, urbanization, medical technology, altered diets, and global mixing have transformed the selective landscape in ways that are still unfolding. A trait like red hair, once preserved partly through relative isolation and regional history, now circulates in a far more connected world. The old boundaries weaken, the variants travel farther, the visible phenotype may appear in places where older observers would never have expected it. That, too, is evolution, though not always the kind popular imagination expects. There is quiet methodological power in this. By studying something familiar and visually striking, researchers can explain broader principles to the public without relying only on abstract models. Red hair makes recessive inheritance easier to grasp. It makes pigmentation chemistry tangible. It makes the distinction between genotype and phenotype vivid. It helps show why a visible trait can skip generations, why regional concentration does not imply purity, and why cultural association can outrun biological prevalence. In classrooms, documentaries, and public science writing, it often serves this function precisely because it is memorable. The body becomes a teaching archive. A colour in the hair opens onto the logic of population genetics. At the same time, red hair reminds researchers to stay humble. For all the progress in genomics and ancient DNA, the full story is still not complete. We know far more than earlier generations did about the role of MC1R and related pathways, but there are still open questions about the exact historical timing of different variants, the contribution of additional genes, the balance between selection and drift, and the degree to which ancient environments favoured or merely tolerated the trait. Ancient DNA samples remain uneven across regions and periods. Preservation is patchy. Some populations leave clearer traces than others. Scholars still debate how confidently modern distributions can be projected backward. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is the normal condition of historical science, where the record is fragmentary and every new genome can adjust the map. And perhaps that is part of why red hair remains so compelling. It is visible enough to feel knowable, yet complicated enough to resist closure. The body offers a clue, but not a final answer. People want a neat origin, but what they find instead is a network pigment chemistry, gene variants, low UV environments, population bottlenecks, migration corridors, island histories, cultural myth-making, and the modern rediscovery of old biology through medical research. No single explanation fully accounts for the trait because the trait itself is the product of several forces layered over one another. Red hair is not a single event in the past. It is a long intersection. This is precisely why scientists return to it. In the laboratory, it offers one kind of clarity. In the field of human history, it offers another. It shows how a trait can be both biologically precise and historically messy. It shows how adaptation never acts alone. It shows how the same genetic pathway can matter for appearance, environmental trade-offs, and perhaps subtle differences in physiological response. And it shows how the public's hunger for simple narratives can be answered, not by supplying another myth, but by demonstrating that complexity itself is the real pattern of human inheritance. There is another lesson here, quieter but equally important. Red hair reveals how evolution is often reconstructed backward from what survives. Scientists begin with living variation. They ask which genes are involved. They trace how those genes behave across populations. They compare modern frequencies with ancient DNA when available. They place the results against climate models, archaeological movements, and demographic history. In other words, they work from the present toward the past. A child with red hair in the modern world becomes, indirectly, part of an inquiry into Ice Age survival, Neolithic admixture, and the ecological meaning of pigment. The living body is not just a product of history, it is evidence of history. That way of thinking changes the emotional tone of the trait. Instead of asking whether red hair is special in some mystical sense, a more interesting question emerges. What kind of past must a population have moved through for this trait to remain visible at all? The answer involves narrow northern suns, small communities, ancient migrations, and countless hidden carriers who passed on variants without knowing it. It involves old trade-offs that still shape modern bodies under unfamiliar conditions. It involves a species constantly mixing, never as pure as its myths, never as uniform as its bureaucracies, and never entirely finished in the way people like to imagine. Seen from that angle, red hair becomes less a badge and more a witness. It testifies to the fact that human history is stored unevenly in the body. Some of that history is obvious only to scientists reading genomes. Some of it is obvious to anyone standing in daylight. The vividness of red hair makes it easy to forget how ordinary its deeper lesson really is. Every visible trait is a record of selections made by climate, migration, diet, reproduction, and accident. Red hair simply makes the record easier to notice. And once noticed, it pulls the eye beyond itself. The real significance of the trait is not that it marks one kind of person as fundamentally different from another. It is that it demonstrates how difference arises at all, how it persists without becoming destiny, and how the body keeps traces of old environments long after the world that shaped them has changed. The mysterious gene behind red hair, then, is not mysterious because it belongs to an isolated secret. It is mysterious because it opens into the full complexity of human evolution, where no visible feature can be explained by one cause alone. That larger perspective prepares the ground for the final turn in the story. Red hair has survived prehistory, migration, and cultural projection. It has been studied, misunderstood, celebrated, and mocked. It has revealed how genes work, how traits endure, and how biology and folklore become tangled. But one question still remains. Why has this particular trait, more than so many others, stayed so potent in the imagination even after science has explained so much of its mechanism? Why does the mystery remain when the chemistry is known and the gene is mapped? The answer lies in the strange durability of history itself, and in the way some inherited traces survive not by dominating the world, but by outlasting every attempt to reduce them to a single meaning. The longer the story is examined, the less red hair looks like an anomaly, and the more it looks like a lesson in endurance. Not endurance in the heroic sense that myths prefer, as though one dramatic lineage carried a fiery trait intact through the ages, like a banner that never fell. Something quieter than that. Something more durable precisely because it is less obvious. Red hair survives not by dominating populations, but by moving through them in fragments, in hidden combinations, in family lines that may not visibly express it for generations and then suddenly do. It lives in carriers, in chance pairings, in isolated communities, in migrations that scatter it farther than reputation remembers. It is one of those inherited traces that persists because human history does not move in clean lines. It loops, narrows, mixes, forgets, and then unexpectedly reveals what it has been carrying all along. That is why conquest never erased it. Empire never erased it. Famine, migration, conversion, urban growth, industrialization, and modern mobility did not erase it either. All of those forces changed the populations through which red hair-associated variants moved. They altered frequencies, blurred regional distinctions, and redistributed ancestry again and again. But they did not eliminate the trait, because traits like this are not stored in one visible group waiting to be wiped away. They are stored diffusely, across lineages, across quiet carriers, across the ordinary human fact that inheritance can preserve possibilities long after the conditions that first tolerated them have changed. The trait survives history because it does not depend on historical stability. It depends only on continuity through reproduction, and human continuity, however interrupted it seems, is astonishingly stubborn. This is one of the most revealing things about genes in general. People often imagine that strong historical change must produce equally strong biological replacement, as if each invasion or migration sweeps away what came before. Sometimes the effects are indeed profound. Ancient DNA has made that impossible to deny. Populations can shift dramatically. New ancestries can spread with startling force. Yet even then, complete erasure is rarer than older myths suggested. More often, history is additive, layered, partial. New people arrive, but they do not always wipe out every local lineage. Existing populations endure, but they do not remain untouched. The result is mixture. And within mixture, rare traits can survive with almost eerie persistence. A variant does not need political power or cultural prestige to continue. It needs only enough unnoticed passage through living bodies. That unnoticed passage is what makes red hair such an effective witness to long time. A kingdom may vanish and leave only ruins. A language may recede until it survives in a few place names and old songs. A religion may fragment. A coastline may drown. A people may be renamed by conquerors and later renamed again by historians. Yet somewhere in the middle of all that, the body keeps transmitting small instructions forward. A receptor functions a little differently in pigment cells. A balance tips toward pheomelanin. A child is born with hair that catches light in an old familiar way, though no one around them can trace the full route by which it arrived. In that sense, red hair is not only about origin, it is about transmission. It is a survival of process rather than a survival of purity. Modern history complicates this further, because the world that once preserved the trait in pockets and regions has become radically more connected. Urbanization pulls families out of local marriage networks. International migration scrambles ancestries that would once have remained regionally concentrated. Medical technology changes survival patterns. Sun exposure shifts with clothing, labor, architecture, and travel. The old ecological and demographic conditions that shape the distribution of red hair no longer operate in the same way. And yet the trait remains. In some ways, it becomes more globally visible precisely as it becomes less regionally bounded. A child with red hair may now be born in any major city on Earth to a family whose genetic history crosses many borders. The colour still points backward, but the map behind it grows harder to draw with older certainties. That modern dispersion has an interesting consequence. It weakens the old essentialist myths while strengthening the sense that red hair belongs to deep human history rather than to one narrow identity. The trait no longer sits only inside the stories told by the Atlantic fringe. Even though those stories remain powerful, it appears in diaspora, in mixed families, in places where local tradition offers no ready-made interpretation for it. That can make the trait feel even more mysterious on a personal level. When red hair appears outside the regions most strongly associated with it, people often treat it as evidence of a distant ancestor, a hidden branch in the family tree, a sleeping trace suddenly reawakened. Sometimes that intuition is broadly correct, but the further science goes, the clearer it becomes that the hidden branch is rarely singular. It is usually many branches layered together, their contributions compressed into one visible result. This is why the mystery remains even after genetics has done so much to explain the mechanism. The chemistry is known in outline, the major gene is identified, the environmental logic is plausible, the demographic mechanisms are well understood, and still the trait resists becoming emotionally ordinary. Partly that is because red hair sits at an unusual crossing point between rarity and familiarity. It is rare enough to stand out, yet common enough that most people know someone who has it, or have it themselves, or have seen it recur unexpectedly in a family line. It is not rare like a severe disorder or an obscure anomaly. It is rare like a recurring reminder that inheritance still contains surprises. That kind of rarity remains psychologically powerful even when scientifically explained. There is also the fact that red hair keeps exposing the limits of one-cause thinking. People want to know whether the trait exists because of northern sunlight, or because of MC1R, or because of Scottish ancestry, or because of founder effects, or because of ancient migrations, or because of sexual selection, or because of Neanderthal shadows. The answer is unsatisfying only if one expects simplicity. In truth, the trait exists because all of these forces, in different proportions, helped shape the conditions under which it could emerge, persist, disperse, and remain visible. Remove the genetic pathway and the trait does not happen. Remove the low UV environments and the broader pigment reduction story changes. Remove the demographic bottlenecks and regional concentrations weaken. Remove migration, and the variants never spread the way they do. Remove culture and the trait loses much of its symbolic force. Red hair is not one explanation. It is the point where several explanations overlap. That overlap is what gives the trait its lingering power in the imagination. A person can look at red hair and see biology, ancestry, climate adaptation, local identity, artistic symbolism, family inheritance, and pure accident all at once. Few traits allow so many readings so quickly. Even fewer allow them while remaining accessible to ordinary perception. One does not need a microscope to notice red hair. That makes it available to folklore in a way most genetic traits are not. But unlike mere folklore, it can also withstand scientific scrutiny and emerge even more interesting. Science does not dissolve the wonder here, it refines it. It replaces fantasy with a more durable kind of mystery, not whether the trait is magical, but how so many ordinary forces combine to make something that feels extraordinary. And there is still one more reason it endures in memory. Red hair is unstable in the best way. It is never fully the same from person to person. It can be bright or muted, copper or auburn, golden or rust dark. It changes with age. Children may lose some intensity as they grow. Adults may darken into richer shades. Beards may reveal tones the scalp hides. Sunlight can turn a subdued colour incandescent for a moment, then let it fade back into brownish shadow. The trait therefore refuses to become a fixed object even in daily life. It behaves like history itself, persistent, variable, and always slightly altered by context. That makes it harder for the mind to flatten. The body keeps reminding us that one category contains many stories. When people ask where red hair comes from, then the deepest answer is not a place. It is a history of survival through complexity. It comes from the human pigment system, altered by mutation. It comes from ancient northern environments where reduced eumelanin could persist. It comes from small populations where rare variants endured by chance. It comes from migrations that carried those variants across Europe and beyond. It comes from islands, peninsulas, and kin networks that made the trait visible enough to be remembered. It comes from culture, which turned visible rarity into myth, and it comes from the ordinary stubbornness of inheritance, which keeps possibilities alive long after the worlds that first shaped them have changed beyond recognition. That is why no final answer ever feels final enough. A biochemist can explain the pigment, a geneticist can identify the variants, an anthropologist can reconstruct the ancient pressures, a historian can trace the myths, a doctor can note the physiological tendencies. Each is correct within the limits of the discipline. Yet the trait remains larger than any one explanation because human beings do not experience themselves in disciplines. They experience themselves in mirrors, in families, in regional stories, in inherited faces and unexpected children. Red hair survives in all those registers at once. The gene is real. The mystery is real too, but it belongs not to the unknown mechanism anymore. It belongs to the depth of the human past carried quietly in something so visible. And perhaps that is the final irony. The trait endures because it was never strong enough to conquer, never weak enough to vanish, and never ordinary enough to be ignored. It remains where history often leaves its clearest marks at the edge of the common, in those rare features that keep resurfacing to remind the present that it is built from much older things. Red hair is one of those resurfacing traces. It survived because human history made room for it. It remained mysterious because human beings kept asking surface questions of something that belonged to deep time. The story is nearly finished now, but the wider meaning still waits just beyond it. Red hair began as a question about colour and ended as a question about how the species remembers itself. And when a trait can do that, when it can carry chemistry, climate, migration, myth, and survival all at once, it becomes more than a feature. It becomes a way of seeing time inside the body. In the end, the most honest answer to the question is also the least dramatic. Red hair does not come from a lost kingdom, a vanished superpopulation, or a secret line hidden from ordinary history. It comes from the same place all human variation comes from: mutation, inheritance, environment, migration, and chance acting together over very long stretches of time. And yet that answer, once opened fully, turns out to be anything but small. Because the deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that red hair is not interesting simply because it is rare. It is interesting because it preserves, in a visible form, the way human evolution actually works, not as a clean story of progress, not as a simple map of peoples, but as a messy survival of possibilities through changing worlds. What makes the mystery endure is not ignorance of the mechanism. The chemistry is broadly known. The role of MC1R is established. The shift toward pheomelanin rather than eumelanin is no longer obscure. The connection to fair skin, freckling, and light sensitivity is well understood in outline. The wider environmental story, involving lower ultraviolet conditions and the toleration of reduced pigmentation in northern latitudes, is compelling. Founder effects, bottlenecks, and regional isolation explain why the trait becomes especially visible in some places and not others. Ancient DNA has deepened the picture, even if it has not completed it. By the standards of historical biology, this is already a remarkably rich explanation, and still, no single explanation fully accounts for red hair's peculiar hold on both science and imagination. That lingering hold exists because the trait refuses to collapse into one level of meaning. At the cellular level, it is pigment signaling. At the genetic level, it is inherited variation, often involving specific MC1R variants and related pathways. At the ecological level, it belongs to low-light environments where very fair pigmentation could persist with lower penalty than in high UV climates. At the demographic level, it reflects bottlenecks, drift, migration, and local concentration in small populations. At the historical level, it survives through conquests and mixtures without requiring purity. At the cultural level, it attracts symbolism far beyond what biology alone would warrant. Each layer is real. None is sufficient by itself. Red hair remains mysterious not because science has failed, but because the human past rarely arranges itself into one-story answers. The body, after all, is never only biology. It is history made flesh, but history is complicated. A trait visible in the present may owe its existence to ancient climates, yet its modern meaning may come from medieval superstition, 19th century nationalism, schoolyard teasing, film casting, family memory, and medical research all at once. Red hair carries that entire burden unusually clearly because it is so easy to notice. Most of the body's evolutionary record is hidden. This part is not. It sits in plain sight, and because it does, every era has tried to explain it in its own language. Folklore explains it one way, race theory another, genetics another, personal identity yet another. None completely displaces the others, even now. That is partly why red hair has remained such an inviting target for false certainties. People still want it to prove more than it can prove. They want it to certify ancestry, to confirm romance, to mark national essence, to reveal personality, or to connect the present directly to some dramatic prehistoric source. But the actual evidence points elsewhere. It points toward accumulation rather than origin myth. It points toward many populations carrying relevant variants rather than one special people owning them. It points toward rare, visible expression emerging from a much wider field of hidden inheritance. It points toward the ordinary arithmetic of human reproduction, where traits can disappear from sight for generations and then return with startling force. What survives in the record suggests continuity, but never simplicity. And perhaps that is the trait's deepest significance. Red hair exposes the weakness of all human attempts to make the body too tidy. The old dream of pure lines, fixed types, and readable surfaces keeps collapsing here. A child may carry visible evidence of ancestors spread across migrations no one in the family can name. A region may become famous for a trait it never held in majority. A phenotype may remain rare while its associated variants travel widely and quietly in carriers. A visible difference may produce real physiological patterns without justifying any claim about inner nature. In each case, red hair resists simplification. It behaves exactly the way a real human trait should behave in a species shaped by movement, mixture, and unfinished adaptation. There is something almost humbling in that resistance. Modern people live among maps, categories, censuses, medical classifications, and identity labels so detailed that the body can seem fully explained before one has even asked the right question. Red hair pushes back. Not because it is magical, but because it reminds us that explanation is layered. To say that MC1R matters is true, but partial. To say that low UV environments matter is true, but partial. To say that Scotland and Ireland are important to the modern image of red hair is true, but partial. To say that founder effects and bottlenecks help explain concentration is true, but partial. The trait is the sum of those truths without being reducible to any single one of them. This is why the modern search for certainty often ends where older storytelling began in fascination. The difference is that science gives the fascination better ground to stand on. It strips away the nonsense about cursed bloodlines or hidden superior races. It weakens the old temptations to read character from colour. It reveals that the body's visible diversity is neither random decoration nor symbolic destiny, but a record of many overlapping histories. That record is messy, but it is also more intimate than almost anything else the past leaves behind. Ruins can be excavated, manuscripts can be translated, buried tools can be measured, but a trait like red hair is history still walking around in daylight, still inherited, still changing in frequency, still carrying old environmental bargains into new social worlds. And that brings the question back to where it began. Why does red hair seem to matter so much? Because it is one of those rare traits that allows people to feel, however imperfectly, that the distance between their own body and deep time is not quite as large as it appears. Most of human evolution is hard to feel personally. It belongs to textbooks, bones, genome charts, or museum halls. red hair collapses some of that distance. It says that the ancient negotiations between skin and sunlight, the bottlenecks of small populations, the migrations into colder lands, the quiet passage of hidden variants through countless generations are not abstractions. They are still here. They still surface in living people, in ordinary families, in faces seen on streets or in mirrors. That does not make red hair more human than any other trait. It makes it easier to recognize as human history. The same is true of its rarity. Rarity is part of the meaning, but not because rarity implies superiority or strangeness in any mystical sense. It matters because rare traits are more visible as survivors. They are like fragments of older landscapes left standing after the terrain changes, not untouched, not pure, not outside time, but preserved enough to be noticed. Red hair has lasted because it occupied a narrow but stable zone in the human story tolerated by some environments, carried by migration, amplified by some local histories, never fully erased by later change. That is a very specific kind of endurance. It belongs not to triumph, but to persistence. So the mysterious gene behind red hair is no longer mysterious in the old way. It is not hidden from science. It is not evidence of a secret people. It is not proof of myth. The mystery that remains is larger and, in some ways, more difficult to answer. It is the mystery of how the human past stays alive in the body without ever remaining simple. It is the mystery of why visible difference becomes story so quickly. It is the mystery of how small molecular changes travel through oceans of history and survive wars, winters, marriages, famines, and migrations to appear again, unexpectedly, in a child centuries later. That kind of mystery does not disappear when the gene is mapped. It becomes sharper. And that is why red hair continues to draw attention long after its mechanism is known. It is not only a color, it is a trace. It reminds us that evolution leaves behind survivors that are easy to see but hard to summarize, and that the body is full of ancient compromises still moving through the present. Red hair began as a question about appearance. It ends as a lesson in how human beings are made by chemistry, by landscape, by accident, by inheritance, by story, and by time itself. Nothing in that lesson is supernatural, but almost none of it is simple either. The color lingers after the explanation does, even once the genes are named, the pigment pathways traced, the migrations mapped, and the old myth set aside. Red hair still leaves behind that same quiet impression it always has, that something ancient has remained visible in the modern world without ever fully explaining itself. Not because the science is weak, but because time rarely leaves behind anything as a single clean answer. It leaves layers, it leaves survivals, it leaves small human details that carry much larger histories inside them. And red hair is one of those details. A narrow shift in pigment becomes a thread running from dim northern skies to present-day faces, from Ice Age survival to family photographs, from forgotten bottlenecks to children born centuries later under entirely different conditions. The people who first carried the variants behind it are gone. Their camps vanished, their dialects disappeared, their coastlines changed shape, their worlds sank, froze, greened, flooded, and were built over by others. But the inheritance moved on quietly, passing through bodies that never knew what exactly they were preserving. That may be the most human part of the story. So much of what survives from the past does not survive as memory. It survives as pattern, in bone, in blood, in tolerance to sunlight, in the way pigment settles into skin and hair. Civilizations like to believe they are defined by what they build, write, and remember. Yet the species is also shaped by what it carries unknowingly. A visible trait appears in the mirror, and behind it lie migrations no one witnessed, climates no one chose, and countless generations who simply lived long enough to pass something on. Perhaps that is why red hair has always seemed larger than itself. It is rare, yes, and striking, yes, but more than that, it feels like evidence that the past is never entirely gone, not preserved neatly, not preserved purely, but preserved in fragments that still surface, a flash of copper in weak sunlight, freckles appearing with the season. A family surprised by a child who seems to have inherited a colour from nowhere, when in truth it has come from many places at once. And so the story closes where all human stories eventually do, not with certainty, but with continuity. The old landscapes are gone. The people who crossed them are gone. The cold skies that once shaped these inheritances shine now over different nations, different roads, different lives, yet the trait remains, small and vivid, carrying its long unfinished history forward, not as a relic of a lost world, but as proof that lost worlds do not vanish completely. Sometimes they survive in the most ordinary and visible ways of all,